The cold truth is that early humans did not survive endless rain and snow simply by being tougher than we are. Water was a quiet enemy. A wet skin could steal warmth faster than hunger stole strength. A leaking shelter could turn one night into a slow danger. Yet people still slept, carried children, protected fire, and crossed wet lands where the sky seemed never to clear. The strange part is this: staying dry was never only about keeping water away. So what did early humans really learn from endless rain and snow? There is a quiet danger in cold water that does not look dramatic at first. It does not arrive like a predator. It does not need teeth, speed, or a sudden attack. It can begin with rain falling through branches, snow melting against skin, wet grass pressing against bare legs, or damp animal hide clinging too closely to the body. For early humans living through long seasons of rain and snow, staying dry was not a matter of comfort. It was one of the small boundaries between a difficult night and a dangerous one. The human body produces heat all the time. Even at rest, even in sleep, it is quietly working to keep its inner temperature steady, but water changes the rules. When skin or clothing becomes wet, heat can leave the body much faster than it does in dry air. Wet material draws warmth away. Wind passing over wet skin makes that loss even sharper. In cold conditions, this can become serious before a person fully understands what is happening. A tired body may first feel only uncomfortable, then stiff, then slow, then confused. Long before death, cold and wetness can weaken judgment, movement, and the ability to care for others. This matters because early humans did not face rain and snow with modern walls, sealed roofs, waterproof fabric, or dry spare clothing waiting nearby. Their protection came from what they could find, make, carry, repair, and remember. A rock shelter might block some of the rain, but not all of the wind. A hide might hold warmth, but if it became soaked, it could grow heavy and cold. A fire might dry the air around it, but wet fuel could be hard to light and harder to keep alive. Nothing was perfect. Survival depended on many imperfect protections working together. The title asks how early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow, but the first answer is not a single invention. It begins with understanding the threat. Water falling from the sky was only one part of it. Water on the ground mattered too. A person could avoid direct rain and still lie on damp earth that pulled warmth from the back and legs through the night. Snow could look soft and clean, yet melt against warm skin and become water. Breath could dampen coverings. Sweat from walking could turn dangerous once the body stopped moving. In a cold, wet world, even the body's own moisture had to be managed. That is the cold truth behind this subject. Early humans were not simply stronger versions of modern people. Their bodies still needed warmth. Their children still became cold. Their hands still stiffened. Their sleep could still be broken by wind, wet ground, or the slow failure of a fire. What made survival possible was not toughness alone, but attention. They had to notice which places stayed drier after rain. They had to learn which branches shed water better, which slopes drained faster, which caves trapped smoke, which hides kept warmth, and which fires could be protected from wet air. Being wet also carried a deeper cost, because it affected time and energy. A wet covering had to be dried. A damp sleeping place had to be improved. Firewood had to be gathered from places where it had not rotted or soaked through. People could not spend every hour hunting, walking, or making tools if rain and snow kept undoing the work of staying warm. In this way, water shaped daily life. It decided where people paused, how long they stayed, what they carried, and how carefully they prepared for night. So before we imagine grand shelters or clever clothing, we have to sit with the simplest fact. In cold rain and snow, dryness was not an extra layer of comfort. It was a form of protection. It helped preserve body heat, sleep, movement, and clear thinking. For early humans, a dry patch of ground, a sheltered flame, a skin kept from soaking through, or a body turned away from the wind could matter as much as a tool in the hand. The story of staying dry begins there, with a danger so ordinary that it could be missed until it had already entered the bones. Rain and snow do not harm the body in only one way. They work together with air, ground, clothing, and time. A single drop of cold rain may mean almost nothing, but rain that continues for hours changes the whole surface of life. Hair becomes damp, skin cools. The outer layer of a hide or fur begins to hold moisture. Hands lose their quickness. Feet become heavy. A person who was warm while walking may begin to chill as soon as the group stops. For early humans moving through wet forests, open tundra, river valleys, or snow-covered ground, the danger was not always sudden freezing. More often, it was a slow stealing of warmth, little by little, until the body had to spend more strength simply staying alive. One reason water is so dangerous in cold weather is that it carries heat away from the body more effectively than dry air. When wetness sits against the skin, the body warms that water, and then the moving air or cold surface takes that warmth away. If wind is present, the loss becomes stronger, because wind removes the thin layer of warmer air near the body. This is why a cold, rainy day can feel harsher than a still, snowy one. The temperature alone does not tell the whole story. Wetness, wind, and exposure combine. Early humans did not need scientific words for this process, but their lives would have taught it clearly. A person who slept too close to damp ground woke colder. A hide that was soaked through no longer felt protective in the same way. A fire placed where wind drove rain into it struggled to survive. Snow added another layer to the problem. Dry snow in very cold air can sometimes brush away, but snow near the warmth of the body melts. It becomes water. A covering that looked useful at first could become damp from melted snow. Feet moving through snow could grow wet if protection was poor. A person carrying snow on hair, shoulders, or a skin wrap might bring that moisture into a shelter where it slowly became cold water. This matters directly to the question of how early humans stayed dry, because avoiding rain was not enough. They also had to understand melting, dripping, pooling, and drying. They had to keep snow from becoming hidden water inside the small world where people slept. The ground was just as important as the sky. After rain, earth can hold moisture long after the clouds have passed. Moss, leaves, mud, and frozen soil each create different problems. A person lying on wet ground loses warmth by contact. Even with a covering, the lower side of the body can become cold if the insulation is thin or compressed. In snowy places, the surface may seem soft, but body heat can melt the snow beneath, creating dampness exactly where rest is needed. This is why a dry sleeping layer would have mattered so much. Leaves, grass, brush, bark, hides, or raised branches were not decorative. They were ways of separating warm bodies from wet earth. Wind made every mistake more costly. A shelter that stopped rain but allowed cold air to pass through could still leave people shivering. A hide that worked well in still air might fail if wind pushed water through gaps. Fire, smoke, sparks, and warmth all behaved differently when wind shifted. For early humans, a good place to stop was not only a place with cover overhead, it was a place where water drained away, where wind was reduced, where fuel could be kept usable, and where bodies could rest without being pressed into damp ground. This was practical knowledge, learned by watching the same forces return again and again. There is also the problem of time. Cold wetness becomes more dangerous the longer it lasts. A short rain may be endured. Endless rain is different. A brief crossing through snow may be manageable. A season of snow requires habits. The longer moisture stays near the body, the more energy the body spends defending its warmth. That energy is not endless. It is taken from food, from rest, from movement, from attention. A cold person may become slower at making decisions. A tired group may become less careful with fire, shelter, or children. In this way, rain, snow, wind, and wet ground were not separate problems. They formed one quiet system pressing against early human life. Staying dry meant interrupting that system wherever possible, turning away from wind, choosing higher ground, protecting the fire, drying hides, lifting the body from wet soil, shaking snow away before it melted, and stopping before exhaustion made every small task harder. The answer was not one perfect invention. It was many small acts repeated in the right order, because in endless rain and snow, warmth was not kept by strength alone. It was kept by understanding how water moved. It is easy to imagine early humans as people who could simply endure more than we can, as if the past itself made the body harder, quieter, and less vulnerable. But that picture can be misleading. They were human bodies living under harder conditions. Their skin still cooled when wet, their fingers still stiffened in cold air, their children still needed warmth, their elders still became tired, their sleep still mattered. If a person lost too much heat, strength and judgment could fade. So the story of rain and snow is not a story of bodies that ignored cold. It is a story of people who slowly learned how to reduce cold before it became stronger than them. This difference is important for the whole video. If early humans survived endless wet weather only because they were tougher, then there would be little to explain. But if they survived because they noticed, tested, remembered, and taught, then every small detail begins to matter. A stone overhang matters. The dry side of a fallen tree matters. A patch of grass that drains better matters. A hide turned with the fur outward or inward may matter in different weather. The place where smoke can leave a shelter matters. The decision to stop before darkness matters. Staying dry was not one heroic act. It was a chain of quiet judgments made again and again. Many of those judgments would not leave clear traces in the archaeological record. We do not usually find the exact dry leaves someone placed under a sleeping child, or the precise branch arrangement that kept rain from dripping onto a fire. Organic materials decay. Soft shelters vanish. Hides, bark, grasses, and wooden frames rarely survive over deep time unless conditions are unusual. This means we must be careful. We should not invent perfect scenes and pretend they are proven. But we can say something reasonable. People who lived through cold rain and snow had to use available materials and landscape features to reduce exposure, because the human body could not safely remain wet and cold for long periods. Their intelligence lived in practical choices as much as in tools made of stone. The first layer of that intelligence was observation. After many storms, people would know that some places looked sheltered but became channels for water. Some caves trapped damp air. Some hollows gathered cold. Some slopes shed rain quickly. Some branches bent water away. Some ground stayed muddy long after the sky cleared. These lessons did not require writing. They could live in movement, habit, gesture, and memory. A child could learn where not to sit. A young hunter could learn not to rest in sweat-soaked coverings after walking hard. A group could learn which fuel smoked too much when damp, which wood still burned, and which place near the shelter needed to stay dry for the night. Avoiding wetness also required timing. The body can become wet from rain, but also from effort. Walking wrapped too heavily may cause sweating. Then, when the group stops, that moisture cools. This is a subtle problem, but it connects directly to survival in rain and snow. Early humans had to balance movement and rest, warmth and ventilation, cover and overheating. They may not have described it in modern terms, but they would have felt the consequences. A person who arrived at camp soaked with sweat and rain needed drying. A covering placed too close to smoke might be damaged. A fire too exposed might die. A shelter too closed might fill with smoke or dampness. Nothing was simple. Every protection carried another problem to manage. This is why the slow work of staying dry belongs at the center of early human life. It was not separate from hunting, gathering, childcare, travel, or sleep. It shaped all of them. A group could not move well if their feet were always wet and cold. They could not sleep deeply if the ground pulled heat away. They could not protect infants if coverings failed. They could not keep food, tools, and fire useful if everything became soaked. The struggle against wetness was woven into the daily rhythm of survival. It turned knowledge of landscape into protection. It turned shared memory into warmth. It turned small habits into a kind of shelter before any shelter was built. So when we ask how early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow, we should not begin with the idea that they were beyond discomfort. We should begin with the more honest idea. They were vulnerable, and because they were vulnerable, they had to become attentive. Their advantage was not that cold water could not hurt them. Their advantage was that over many generations, they learned how to notice water before it reached the skin, before it soaked the ground, before it killed the fire, before it entered sleep. That is where the first part of this story ends, not with a perfect answer, but with a careful human posture toward a wet world. The human body is not naturally dressed for endless rain and snow. That simple fact sits at the center of this story. Compared with many animals that live in cold, wet places, humans have exposed skin, little body hair, and a strong ability to sweat. These traits can be useful in other environments, especially when the body needs to release heat during long movement. But in cold rain or blowing snow, the same body becomes strangely open to the world. Water reaches the skin easily. Wind moves across it easily. Heat leaves more quickly when the outer surface of the body becomes wet. Early humans did not step into wet seasons with thick fur, waterproof feathers, or a natural shell of protection. They had to build their protection outside the body. This does not mean the human body was weak in every way. It could walk long distances. It could adapt to different climates. It could heal, learn, carry, throw, make, and cooperate. But against cold wetness, the body had clear limits. Bare skin loses heat. Wet skin loses it faster. Fingers become less precise when cold. Feet that stay wet can become painful and damaged. Children lose heat more easily than adults because their bodies are smaller. A person who is tired, hungry, or already chilled has less reserve. In endless rain and snow, survival was not about denying these limits. It was about arranging life around them. One of the most important human traits in this question is sweating. Sweat helps cool the body, especially during movement. But moisture that is useful during heat can become dangerous after movement stops. Imagine early humans walking through wet ground, climbing a slope, carrying tools, food, or a child. Their bodies warm with effort. If they are wrapped in hides or moving under heavy cover, they may sweat. Then, when they stop to rest, cold air and wet material begin to draw that warmth away. The body that was protected a moment ago may now be cooling from its own moisture. Staying dry, then, was not only about blocking rain, it was also about managing the moisture the body made for itself. This is one reason the question is more complex than it first appears. Early humans needed covering, but too much covering during hard movement could create sweat. They needed shelter, but too closed a shelter could become smoky, damp, or poorly ventilated. They needed fire, but fire required fuel, attention, and space. They needed hides, but hides had to be kept usable, dried when wet, softened when stiff, and arranged around the body in ways that helped rather than harmed. Their own skin was not enough. Their protection had to be learned, repaired, and adjusted to weather that could change from rain to snow, from wind to stillness, from wet cold to freezing cold. The lack of thick body hair also changed how water behaved on human skin. Fur can trap air and slow heat loss when dry, though soaked fur has its own problems. Humans did not have that same full body layer. Water could spread across skin, collect under coverings, and cool the body directly. Hair on the head could become wet and heavy. Hands, face, neck, and feet were especially exposed during work. Every opening in a wrap or shelter became a place where wind and water could enter. This is why clothing and shelter were not separate ideas. A hide around the shoulders, a dry layer under the body, a windbreak near the fire, and a protected place to sleep all worked together to make up for what the body did not have. The body's vulnerability also made social care important. A strong adult might endure a wet walk better than a child, but the group survived only if the vulnerable were protected too. Infants could not choose dry ground. Children might not notice cold early enough. Injured or older people might move more slowly and become wet for longer. In cold, rain, and snow, the body's limits were shared problems. They shaped where the group stopped, how close people slept, who received dry coverings first, and how much effort was spent keeping fire alive through the night. So, When we ask how early humans stayed dry, we are really asking how a mostly hairless, sweating, exposed primate learned to live beyond the protection given by its own skin. The answer begins with accepting that human survival was never only inside the body. It spread outward into animal hides, branches, stone overhangs, dry leaves, hearths, shared warmth, remembered places, and the patient work of keeping wetness from becoming cold. Because the human body did not come with enough natural protection against cold rain and snow, early humans had to extend the body outward. This is one of the deepest ideas in human survival. A tool is not only something held in the hand. A shelter is not only a place outside the body. A fire is not only a source of heat. In wet and freezing conditions, all of these things became extra layers of the human body, built from the world around it. They made up for skin that could be soaked, fingers that could stiffen, feet that could chill, and sleep that could be broken by damp ground. To stay dry, early humans had to live through an outer body made of stone, wood, hide, flame, memory, and shared labor. Stone tools mattered because animal skins and plant materials do not become useful coverings by themselves. A fresh hide is heavy, wet, and difficult to use. It may need scraping, cleaning, stretching, drying, softening, cutting, or piercing. Archaeologists find stone tools far more often than ancient clothing, because stone survives while skins, fibers, bark, and wood usually decay. This means we must speak carefully. We cannot describe every garment with certainty, but it is reasonable to understand that tools helped people turn animal hides and other natural materials into forms of protection. Without cutting edges and scraping tools, it would have been much harder to make coverings that could be wrapped, tied, repaired, dried, and used again. Fire extended the body in another way. Warmth from fire could replace warmth lost to wet air. It could dry damp hides, warm hands, harden some materials, and create a center around which people could rest. But fire was not automatic. In rain and snow, keeping fire alive required knowledge. Where to gather drier fuel, how to protect embers, where to place the hearth, how to avoid smoke filling a shelter, and how to keep sparks from damaging coverings. Fire was not just a bright object in the dark, it was a continuing task. A group that could keep a small protected fire alive through wet weather had a better chance of drying bodies, tools, hides, and sleeping places. Shelter was the larger extension of the body. A rock overhang, cave entrance, windbreak, brush structure, or hide-covered frame could change the weather immediately around a group. It did not need to create a warm indoor room in the modern sense. It only had to reduce the worst pressures: direct rain, falling snow, wind, and contact with wet ground. Even a small improvement mattered. If a shelter kept the fire from dying, stopped water from dripping onto sleeping bodies, or gave children a drier place to rest, it changed the night. Early humans were not waiting for perfect houses. They were working with partial protection, and partial protection could be enough to survive one more storm. Animal hides were especially important because they moved with the body. A rock shelter could not follow a group across a wet valley. A fire could not walk. But a hide could be carried, wrapped, folded, spread on the ground, hung near an entrance, or placed over a child. A skin with fur could trap air when dry. A hide could block some wind. It could also fail when soaked, stiffen when frozen, or become heavy if not cared for. That is why hides were not magic. They were living materials in a practical sense, needing maintenance. Staying dry meant not only owning a covering, but knowing when to air it, when to turn it, where to store it, and how to keep it from becoming part of the cold. These protections worked best together. A hide without shelter could become wet. A shelter without fire could stay damp. Fire without fuel could vanish. Tools without knowledge could not make good coverings. Knowledge without cooperation could fail when a child, an injured adult, or an elder needed help. This is why early human survival in endless rain and snow should not be imagined as one invention suddenly solving the problem. It was more like a web. Each strand was weak alone, but stronger when connected. A dry layer beneath the body, a windbreak beside the fire, a scraped hide around the shoulders, a chosen slope where water drained away, and a shared memory of where to stop. Together, these became the answer. The body remained vulnerable, but it was no longer alone against the weather. It had made a second skin from the world. Survival often begins with a limit that cannot be ignored. For early humans in cold rain and snow, one of those limits was the body itself. The body could walk, carry, remember, heal, and work with others, but it could not remain wet and cold forever. It could not keep clear thought without warmth. It could not sleep well on soaked ground. It could not protect a child if hands became too numb to hold, tie, lift, or repair. This is why understanding the body's weakness was not a kind of defeat. It was the beginning of intelligence. A person who knows that wet skin steals warmth will turn away from rain sooner. A group that knows children chill quickly will place them closer to warmth. A hunter who knows sweat can become cold after movement will loosen or adjust a covering before rest. These are not dramatic discoveries, but in a wet world, they matter. The human body taught its own lessons slowly. A person who slept in a low hollow after rain might wake colder than someone who slept on slightly higher ground. A group that entered a shelter with snow clinging to hides might learn that the snow would melt and dampen the sleeping area. A covering that felt warm while dry might become heavy and unpleasant after hours of rain. A fire built where wind pushed smoke and water inward might make the shelter harder to use. These experiences could become memory. Memory could become habit. Habit could become culture. Long before people had written explanations, the body itself would have shown what worked and what failed. Pain, shivering, stiffness, fatigue, and relief were all forms of information. This connects directly to how early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow. They did not need to understand heat loss in modern scientific language to recognize patterns. They could feel that wet ground made sleep colder. They could see that some hides dried better near warmth, but could be damaged if placed too close to flame. They could notice that dense brush reduced wind more than open ground. They could learn that moving all day in wet conditions required a dry pause before sleep, if such a pause was possible. Staying dry was not only a physical task, it was a discipline of attention built around the body's needs. The body also forced people to plan ahead. If wetness was already inside the shelter by nightfall, it was harder to fix. If all fuel was soaked before a storm, fire became uncertain. If a hide was neglected after rain, it might be less useful the next day. If people waited until they were exhausted before finding shelter, even small tasks became harder. The body's limits made timing important. To stay dry, people had to act before the worst moment. They had to choose stopping places before darkness. They had to protect embers before heavy rain. They had to keep some materials away from the wettest ground. They had to understand that the body becomes less capable exactly when it most needs protection. This was not a perfect system. Early humans still suffered cold. They still became wet. Some nights must have been miserable. Some storms must have defeated their preparations. It would be dishonest to imagine that every group always had a dry shelter, a strong fire, and well-prepared hides. The archaeological record reminds us to be humble, because many of the soft materials that mattered most have disappeared. But we can say this clearly. Because human bodies were vulnerable to wet cold, any group living in rain and snow had strong reason to develop habits that reduced exposure. Those habits may have included choosing sheltered landscapes, using hides and plant materials, maintaining fire, raising sleeping surfaces, sharing warmth, and learning from repeated weather. In that sense, the weakness of the body became the teacher of the mind. It pushed early humans to look outward, to the slope of the land, the shape of a rock, the direction of the wind, the dryness of fuel, the behavior of smoke, the weight of a wet hide, and the quiet needs of sleeping bodies. The body did not give them a thick natural coat, but it gave them signals. It warned them when wetness had gone too far. It rewarded them when warmth returned. It made comfort and survival hard to separate. So the first great lesson of staying dry may have been very simple. Listen to the body before the cold speaks louder. From that lesson grew the need for tools, shelters, fire, coverings, and shared care. Early humans did not overcome rain and snow by escaping their limits. They survived by learning those limits closely, then building a life around them. Animal skin was never just an early form of clothing. In cold rain and snow, it could become a movable wall between the human body and the weather. A hide could be wrapped around shoulders, placed over sleeping bodies, spread beneath a person on damp ground, hung near the edge of a shelter, or used to protect a child from wind. It was not perfect. It could become wet, heavy, stiff, smoky, torn, or difficult to dry. But compared with bare skin exposed to rain, snow, and moving air, a prepared animal hide could change the body's immediate world. It could slow the escape of warmth. It could reduce the bite of wind. It could create a small pocket of warmer air near the skin. And in a life where a few degrees of warmth could affect sleep, strength, and judgment, that small pocket mattered. The first value of a hide was insulation. Fur and skin can trap air when they are dry enough, and trapped air slows heat loss. This is one reason many animals survive cold climates with dense coats. Early humans did not have that kind of full-body natural covering, but by using animal skins, they could borrow part of that protection from the animals they hunted or scavenged. A fur-covered hide around the body did not make a human into a cold-weather animal, but it gave the body something it lacked, a layer that could hold warmth outside the skin. In snow or cold wind, this could be deeply important. The hide did not create heat by itself. The body still produced the warmth. The hide helped keep that warmth from leaving too quickly. The second value was wind protection. Wind can make wet cold more dangerous because it strips away the thin layer of warmer air close to the body. A hide, especially if wrapped well, could reduce that movement of air. Even when it did not fully block rain, it might slow the wind enough for a person to remain more stable. This connects directly to the question of staying dry, because dryness was not only about water, it was also about preventing water and wind from working together. A slightly damp body in still air might endure. A damp body in strong wind could lose heat much faster. So a hide that blocked wind helped the body defend itself against wetness, even when the hide itself was not perfectly waterproof. The third value was water shedding, though we should speak carefully here. It would be too simple to say that all early hides were waterproof like modern rain gear. They were not. A raw or poorly prepared hide could soak, rot, stiffen, or smell. Different animals, different treatments, different weather, and different levels of wear would change how useful a skin could be. But a hide with fur, grease, or careful preparation could shed some water for a time, especially compared with bare skin or thin plant material. It might keep falling snow from touching the body directly. It might hold rain on the outer surface long enough for a person to reach shelter. It might be turned, shaken, dried, smoked, scraped, or reused. The point is not that hides solved wet weather completely. The point is that they gave early humans something to work with. Hides also mattered because they could be rearranged. A shelter made of stone stayed where it was. A tree canopy could not move with a group, but a skin could be carried from one camp to another. It could be used as clothing while walking, then as bedding at night. It could cover an opening when wind shifted. It could be folded under a child or shared between two people. This flexibility made hides especially valuable in landscapes where rain and snow did not behave the same every day. One morning might bring wet snow. One afternoon might bring wind. One night might bring frozen ground. A useful skin could answer several problems, not perfectly, but enough to reduce exposure. Still, hides required care. A soaked hide could become a burden. If frozen, it might stiffen. If left damp too long, it could decay. If placed too close to fire, it could scorch or harden. So using animal skins was not only about having them, it was about knowing how to maintain them. Early humans had to keep coverings dry when possible, dry them after use, avoid damaging them with flame, and repair them when they tore. In this way, animal skin became part of a daily relationship with weather. It had to be watched, handled, and protected, just like fire. So when we ask how early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow, animal hides stand near the center of the answer. Not as magical waterproof coats, and not as proof of a perfect ancient wardrobe, but as practical, imperfect, essential barriers. They help turn exposed human skin into a body with an outer layer. They helped separate warmth from wind, sleep from damp ground, and children from falling snow. They were not just worn, they were used, moved, dried, shared, and remembered. In a cold, wet world, a hide was not only clothing, it was shelter that could travel. A hide taken from an animal is not automatically a useful covering. This is easy to forget, because when we imagine early humans staying warm and dry, we may picture animal skins already wrapped around the body as if they were simple blankets. But fresh skin is heavy, damp, uneven, and full of material that can decay. It can stiffen, smell, tear, or become difficult to fold. To turn it into something that protects against rain, snow, wind, and cold ground, people had to work on it. That work may have included scraping away tissue, stretching the skin, drying it, softening it, cutting it into useful shapes, piercing holes, tying it with sinew or plant fibers, and repairing it after damage. We should be careful about the exact methods in different times and places, because organic materials rarely survive for very long. But the general truth is strong. A hide had to be transformed before it could become reliable protection. Scraping was one of the basic steps. A stone scraper or sharp edge could remove fat, flesh, and other material from the inner side of the skin. If these remained, the hide could rot more easily or become unpleasant to use. Scraping also helped make the material thinner and more flexible. This matters directly to staying dry, because a stiff, dirty, heavy hide is harder to wrap, dry, carry, or sleep under. A more prepared hide can fit closer to the body, fold around shoulders, lie flatter on the ground, or hang more usefully near a shelter opening. It does not become modern waterproof clothing, but it becomes a material that can answer weather more effectively. Drying was another important part of the process. Water inside a hide changes its weight and feel. If a hide stays damp too long, it can decay. If it dries too quickly or too harshly, it can become stiff. Early humans would have needed patience and attention, placing hides where air could move, where smoke or warmth might help, but where flame would not damage them. A hide near a fire could dry, but too much heat could harden or ruin it. A hide left in rain could become worse than useless. This balance between drying and damaging shows how practical knowledge had to be exact in daily life. Staying dry was not only about the body, it was also about keeping the materials of survival from failing. Softening may have mattered just as much. A hide that cannot bend is not easy to wear or use as bedding. A flexible hide can be wrapped, folded, adjusted, and tied. It can cover the shoulders while walking, then become a sleeping layer at night. It can be tucked around a child or stretched across a small frame. Some later traditional methods of hide preparation use fat, smoke, repeated stretching, or working by hand to keep skin flexible. We should not claim that all early humans used the same methods, but it is reasonable to understand that flexibility was valuable. In cold rain and snow, a covering that could be adjusted quickly was more useful than one that stayed rigid. Cutting and fastening also changed what hides could do. A large skin might cover the body, but a shaped piece could protect a shoulder, foot, head, or sleeping place more effectively. Holes could allow ties. Strips of hide, sinew, or plant fiber could hold pieces together. This kind of work required tools and time. It also required judgment about where a covering needed to open, where it needed to overlap, and how it could stay on the body while moving. Poorly arranged material might let rain run inside. Better arrangement could guide water away, block wind, or hold warmth closer. Once again, the answer to wet weather was not a single object. It was the skill of making that object fit a human life. Repair was part of survival too. A torn hide meant an opening for wind. A loose tie meant rain could enter. A thin, worn place might fail during the next storm. If a group depended on hides for warmth, bedding, shelter edges, or carrying, then maintenance became part of daily routine. The people who scraped, dried, softened, tied, and repaired skins were not doing small background tasks. They were protecting the group from the slow danger of wet cold. Their work may not look heroic from a distance, but it was close to the heart of survival. Much of this work has disappeared from the record because hides decay. The tools may remain, while the coverings vanish. That absence can make ancient life look simpler than it was. We find stone, bone, and sometimes hearths or post holes, but we do not often find the soft layers that kept bodies alive at night. Still, by thinking carefully about the needs of the human body and the properties of animal skin, we can understand why hide preparation was so important. Early humans stayed drier not just by having skins, but by changing skins into usable protection. A hide had to become lighter, cleaner, more flexible, more repairable, and easier to place between the body and the weather. In endless rain and snow, the difference between raw skin and worked hide could be the difference between a burden and a barrier. When we speak about early humans using animal skins to stay dry and warm, we have to speak with care. The idea is reasonable, but the evidence is not as simple as finding a complete coat from deep prehistory and saying, this is exactly what everyone wore. Most clothing, bedding, ties, baskets, bark covers, grass layers, and soft shelter materials were made from organic things. Skin, sinew, plant fiber, wood, leaves, and bark usually disappear over time. They rot, burn, break down, or are destroyed by weather, insects, soil, and water. Stone lasts much longer. Bone can last under the right conditions. Charcoal can survive. But the soft materials that may have done much of the work of keeping people dry often vanish. This means the story of staying dry must be built from careful clues, not from overconfident pictures. Archaeologists can find stone scrapers, cutting tools, bone tools, hearths, traces of shelters, and sometimes rare preserved fibers or impressions. These clues tell us that early humans worked materials. They cut, scraped, shaped, pierced, and repaired. In colder environments, it is very reasonable to connect some of this work to animal hides and coverings, because the human body needed protection, and because hides would have been available from hunted or scavenged animals. But we should not pretend that every group in every place had the same clothing, the same shelter, or the same method of keeping rain away. A group in a cold open steppe, a group near a forest, a group near a rocky coastline, and a group in a snowy valley would not all solve wetness in exactly the same way. The materials around them were different. The animals were different. The seasons were different. The amount of rain and snow was different. This is why the honest answer is more powerful than a false exact answer. We can say that animal hides likely played an important role in protection from cold, wind, damp ground, and falling snow. We can say that tools made the preparation of hides more possible. We can say that people living in cold, wet conditions had strong practical reasons to scrape, dry, soften, tie, and repair skins. But we should not describe a perfect prehistoric raincoat unless the evidence supports it. The past was probably more mixed, more local, and more improvised than that. Some coverings may have been rough. Some may have been skillfully prepared. Some may have failed. Some may have worked only for a season. Some may have been shared, patched, smoked, dried by fire, folded under sleepers, or hung where rain entered a shelter. This uncertainty does not weaken the story. It makes it more human. Staying dry in endless rain and snow was not a finished technology handed to everyone at once. It was a set of practical habits shaped by need. A hide that shed some rain for a while was useful. A fur layer that trapped warmth when dry was useful. A skin placed between a body and damp ground was useful. A piece repaired before nightfall was useful. Even if none of these things were perfect, they reduced exposure. And in cold, wet weather, reducing exposure may be enough to change the outcome of a night. The difficulty is that the very things that mattered most may have left the fewest traces. A dry, sleeping layer of grass might disappear. A hide hung at a shelter entrance might decay. A child's wrap might leave nothing behind. A strip of sinew used to tie a covering might vanish completely. Because of this, we must listen to the archaeological record without forcing it to say more than it can. Stone tools can show that people had the ability to process materials. Wear marks on tools can sometimes suggest scraping or working hides. Later and better preserved examples can help us understand what is possible. But the exact daily arrangements of early wet weather life often remain out of reach. For a sleep audio story, this careful honesty matters. It keeps the video grounded. It prevents the listener from being given a fantasy dressed as science. The real wonder is not that we know every detail. The real wonder is that humans, with vulnerable skin and no natural waterproof coat, learned to make partial answers from a difficult world. They turned animal bodies into coverings, stones into scrapers, fire into a drying force, and memory into better choices. They did this without leaving us a complete wardrobe to examine. So, the best way to understand animal skins is to hold two thoughts at once. First, they were probably central to surviving cold rain and snow. Second, we must remain humble about the exact forms they took. Between those two truths is the most honest picture. Early humans stayed dry, not through perfect evidence or perfect clothing, but through imperfect materials used with growing skill. Before a shelter was something built, it was something found. Early humans living through rain and snow did not always need to invent a roof from nothing. The land already offered partial shelters, caves, rock overhangs, cliff faces, hollowed banks, dense stands of trees, the lee side of a boulder, or the dry edge beneath a fallen trunk. None of these places was perfect. A cave could be damp inside. An overhang could still allow wind to enter. A line of trees might drip for hours after rain ended. A hollow could collect cold air. But in a wet world, even partial cover changed the body's situation. It could stop direct rain from striking the skin. It could reduce snow landing on bedding. It could keep a fire alive longer. It could give people a place where hides and fuel did not become soaked as quickly. That was enough to matter. The first question was not, where is a comfortable home? It was, where does the water go? A place that looked sheltered could still be dangerous if rain ran through it, pooled under it, or dripped from stone above. Early humans had to learn the behavior of water in the landscape. A rock overhang with dry ground beneath it after a storm would be more valuable than one that looked impressive but leaked. A cave entrance facing the wrong direction might invite wind-driven rain. A slope might shed water quickly, while a flat hollow remained wet and cold. The best natural shelter was not just a roof. It was a relationship between stone, soil, wind, drainage, and fire. To stay dry, people had to read that relationship. Caves often occupy a strong place in our imagination, but they were not simple safe rooms. Some caves are deep, cold, damp, smoky, or difficult to use. Others may have offered useful dry areas near entrances, where light and air were better. A deep cave might protect from rain but trap moisture or smoke. A shallow cave or rock shelter might give enough overhead cover while still allowing air to move. The choice would depend on season, weather, group size, fuel, predators, and the need to see outside. The important point is not that early humans always lived in caves. They did not. The important point is that natural stone shelters could provide ready-made protection when the weather made exposed ground dangerous. Rock overhangs may have been especially useful because they were open enough to breathe, but covered enough to reduce falling rain and snow. Beneath an overhang, people could place a hearth, dry hides, sleep away from direct weather, and keep tools or fuel out of the wettest conditions. Still, an overhang had to be judged carefully. Did water drip from the edge? Did wind push rain inward? Was the ground sloped or flat? Was there enough dry fuel nearby? Could smoke leave? Could people see approaching danger? A shelter that helped in one way could create another problem. Staying dry was never separate from staying alert, warm, and able to breathe. Dense vegetation also offered forms of shelter, though again with limits. A thick tree canopy can reduce the force of rain, but it can also drip long after the storm. Branches can break wind, but wet leaves and needles may hold water. A fallen tree, a brushy hollow on higher ground, or the sheltered side of a forest edge could give temporary relief. Early humans likely used such places when stone shelters were not available. In many landscapes, caves were rare or absent. People had to use what the land provided. This means staying dry was not one universal method. It was local knowledge. Here, the rock stays dry. There, the wind is weaker. Under those trees, snow collects less. Beside that slope, water drains away. Natural shelter also shaped social life. A dry overhang could become a place to return to. A known cave entrance could hold memory across seasons. A good windbreak could determine where children slept, where fire was placed, and where wet hides were hung. People did not only occupy these places, they learned them. They remembered which ones failed in heavy rain and which ones held through a long night. They may have returned to useful locations again and again, not because they were permanent homes in the modern sense, but because the land had already done part of the work of sheltering them. So when we ask how early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow, the answer begins partly with geography. The body needed help, and the first helper was often the shape of the earth itself. A cave mouth, a stone lip, a sheltered slope, a stand of trees, or the dry side of a large rock could become the difference between being exposed and being partly protected. These were not grand buildings. They were small agreements with the landscape. Early humans survived by noticing where the rain did not fall as hard, where snow did not gather as deeply, and where the wet ground gave way to something just dry enough for sleep. When the land did not offer enough shelter by itself, early humans had to add to it. They did not always need to build a complete house. Often, the need was smaller and more immediate. Block the wind from one side, cover a sleeping place, keep falling rain off a fire, stop snow from drifting into the place where children rested, or create a dry pocket under a rock edge. For this, natural materials could become temporary walls and roofs. Branches, brush, bark, reeds, grasses, large bones, stones, and animal hides could all be arranged to change how rain, snow, and wind reached the body. These structures may not have looked permanent. Many would have disappeared without leaving clear evidence. But in a wet night, even a fragile barrier could matter. A line of branches leaning against a rock face could break wind. A layer of brush placed overhead could slow falling rain. Bark or hides could shed some water for a time. Grass or leaves could create a drier layer beneath sleepers. Stones could help hold materials in place. In colder open landscapes, large animal bones may sometimes have been used as parts of shelter frames, especially where wood was scarce, though this would depend on place and period. The important point is not that every early human group used the same design. The important point is that people used what the landscape gave them to reduce exposure. A shelter did not need to be beautiful. It needed to interrupt the path of water and wind. Rain teaches the weakness of a shelter very quickly. If the roof is too flat, water gathers. If coverings do not overlap well, water runs through the gaps. If the entrance faces the wind, rain blows inside. If the shelter sits on low ground, water may pool beneath the sleepers. Early humans would have learned these lessons through repeated discomfort. A branch shelter that failed in one storm could be improved in the next. A hide placed at the wrong angle could guide water inward instead of away. A fire set too close to a covering could damage it. A fire set too far away might not dry anything. Every material had its own behavior. Brush could trap air but also hold moisture. Bark could shed water but crack or curl. Hide could block wind but become heavy if soaked. Grass could insulate from the ground but rot if left wet. Shelter was therefore not one object. It was a continuing adjustment. Snow created different problems. Falling snow could be blocked more easily than wind-driven rain, but body heat and fire could melt it into water. A cover that held too much snow might sag. Snow drifting at the entrance could close a space or bring dampness inside when it melted. In some cold conditions, snow itself can act as insulation, but for early humans without modern tools or fixed winter architecture, the main concern in this story remains practical, keeping snow from touching warm bodies, melting into bedding, and putting out fire. A sloped covering, a windbreak, or a raised sleeping surface could all help. Again, the goal was not perfect dryness. The goal was less wetness than the open ground. Animal hides could make a temporary shelter more effective because they were flexible. A hide could cover a gap, hang across an opening, lie over a frame, or be moved when the wind changed. But using hides in shelter created trade-offs. A hide used as a wall was not being worn by someone. A hide near rain might become soaked. A hide near fire might be damaged. This means people had to make choices based on the most urgent need. Was it more important to cover the entrance, protect the child, dry the sleeping place, or wrap the person who was already cold? In endless rain and snow, staying dry was not only a technical skill, it was a set of decisions about limited materials. The most realistic image is not a perfect prehistoric cabin standing against the storm. It is a group making small improvements to a chosen place, leaning branches where wind enters, spreading dry plant matter under bodies, moving fuel farther from dripping stone, shaking snow from hides before bringing them close to the fire, placing children away from the wet edge, and repairing a loose tie before night. These actions would leave little behind for archaeologists, but they answer the central question clearly. Early humans stayed drier by shaping the immediate space around them. They took the rough shelter of the land and added a human layer to it. A cave became more useful with a windbreak. An overhang became more livable with bedding. A tree line became more protective with branches and hides arranged against the weather. The shelter was not only found, and it was not fully built from nothing. It was negotiated, piece by piece, between body, weather, and material. A shelter did not have to be perfect to be life-saving. This may be one of the most important ideas in understanding how early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow. Modern minds often imagine shelter as a complete separation from weather. Walls, roof, floor, doorway, and a dry interior. But early shelters did not need to erase the storm. They needed to reduce it. They needed to turn hard rain into dripping, strong wind into weaker air, deep snow into a protected edge, wet ground into a less dangerous sleeping place, and an exposed fire into a flame that might survive until morning. A shelter that only improved conditions by a small amount could still protect sleep, warmth, and clear thinking. In a cold, wet world, partial shelter was not failure. It was survival measured in degrees. Reducing wind may have been as important as blocking rain. Wind carries cold into every opening. It pushes rain sideways. It makes wet skin lose heat faster. It can drive smoke back toward people or pull heat away from a fire. A simple windbreak, made from branches, stone, brush, hide, or the natural side of a rock, could change the feeling of a place. It did not need to close the group inside. It only had to slow the air enough for bodies to keep more warmth. If a child slept behind a hide where the wind was weaker, that mattered. If damp hands could warm near a fire without the flame being torn sideways, that mattered. The shelter worked not because it conquered weather, but because it made weather less direct. Reducing falling water mattered too. Rain does not need to pour heavily to cause trouble. A steady drip onto bedding can slowly soak the only dry layer people have. Water dripping near fire can weaken heat, create smoke, or spoil fuel. Snow falling onto warm hides can melt and spread moisture into the sleeping area. Early humans had to notice where water entered. A branch could be moved, a hide could be angled, a sleeping place could be shifted away from a drip line, a stone could hold an edge in place. These are small acts, but the whole story of staying dry is made of small acts. A dry place in a shelter may have been only a few body lengths wide, but if it protected the most vulnerable people and the fire, it could carry the group through the night. Keeping fire alive gave shelter another purpose. Fire and shelter depended on each other. A fire in open rain might die. A shelter without fire might remain cold and damp. Together, They created a small zone where wet things could begin to dry, where hands could regain feeling, where hides could release moisture, and where people could sleep more safely. The shelter did not have to be warm everywhere. It needed a center. Around that center, people could arrange bodies, coverings, fuel, tools, and children. The fire made the shelter more than a dry space. The shelter made the fire more than a brief flame. In endless rain and snow, this partnership may have been one of the quiet foundations of survival, but shelter also had to breathe. If a space was closed too tightly, smoke could gather. If it was too open, wind and rain entered. If the fire was too near the covering might scorch. If it was too far away, drying became slow. Early humans had to balance these tensions with judgment, not with fixed rules. The same shelter could work differently in rain, snow, wind, or thaw. A place that protected well in one storm might fail in another. This is why the knowledge of shelter was never only knowledge of building. It was knowledge of weather changing inside a space. Where does the smoke move? Where does water drip? Where does the ground stay cold? Where can a person sleep without touching wet earth? Where can fuel stay usable? These questions shape the night. A shelter also organized care. The driest spot could be given to a child, an injured person, or someone exhausted. Hides could be shared. Wet coverings could be moved closer to warmth while dry ones protected sleepers. Fuel could be placed where it would not soak. People might sleep closer together to conserve heat, while still leaving space for smoke and fire safety. None of this required a perfect roof. It required attention to the needs of the group. A shelter was not only a structure, it was a pattern of use. The same rock overhang could be poor or effective depending on how people arranged themselves beneath it. So the answer to the question is not that early humans defeated endless rain and snow with perfect shelters. They survived by making weather less powerful in the places that mattered most. Less wind on the body, less water on the bedding, less snow near the fire, less contact with cold ground, less exposure during sleep. A small reduction repeated through a long night could become the difference between waking strong enough to move and waking weakened by cold. This is the humility of early shelter. It did not promise comfort, only a little more safety. And for people living close to the weather, a little more safety was already a great achievement. The rain above was not the only danger. The ground below could be just as cold, just as wet, and sometimes more difficult to escape. A person might find a place under a rock overhang where rain no longer falls directly, yet still lie on earth that holds water from the last storm. The body may be partly covered from the sky, but the back, hips, legs, and shoulders press into damp soil, wet leaves, moss, mud, or snow. Through that contact, warmth can leave slowly and steadily. This is why staying dry in endless rain and snow cannot be understood only as finding something overhead. Early humans also had to protect the body from the wetness beneath them. The ground remembers weather. Long after rain has stopped, soil can remain damp. Leaves can hold water, moss can stay wet. Mud can pull heat through any thin covering. Frozen ground can be hard and cold even when dry, and snow can melt under body heat, creating dampness where sleep should happen. At night, when movement slows, the danger becomes stronger. During the day, walking produces heat, but while resting, the body depends on saved warmth, coverings, fire, and the surface beneath it. If that surface is wet, it can make sleep shallow and cold. A person who cannot sleep well may wake tired, less alert, and less able to walk, gather, hunt, or care for others. So the dry, sleeping surface was not a small detail. It was part of survival. Contact with the ground is different from rain on the skin. Rain may be felt immediately, but ground cold can work quietly. A person might think they are sheltered because water is no longer falling. Then, over time, the lower side of the body becomes cold. The covering beneath them compresses under weight, trapping less air. If the layer is damp, it conducts heat away more easily. This means that even a useful animal hide can lose some of its protective value when squeezed between a warm body and wet earth. The answer was not simply to own a hide, but to arrange layers. something beneath, something around, and something above, depending on what materials were available. Early humans had to learn that the place of rest had its own weather. A patch of ground could be dry on the surface but damp underneath. A hollow could collect water and cold air. A slope could drain better but be harder to sleep on. Sand, gravel, leaves, grass, bark, or brush might each behave differently. The best place to lie down was not always the flattest place. It was the place that kept the body away from moisture and allowed water to move away. Higher ground, a natural shelf, a bed of dry plant material, or a surface near but not too close to the fire could matter deeply. The question was not only where can we stop, it was where can the body lose the least warmth while it cannot move. Snow made the problem more complex. Snow can insulate in some conditions, but for a warm body without enough barrier, it can also melt. A person lying near snow, or placing warm hides directly on it, might create wetness slowly. Snow brought into a shelter on feet, hair, hides, or tools could melt near the fire and dampen the floor. If bedding became wet, the night changed. Early humans had to keep snow outside when possible, shake it from coverings, choose where to sit, and avoid letting frozen water become hidden moisture under the body. Again, staying dry was not one act. It was a chain of small controls over water in different forms. The ground also shaped where fire could be used. A hearth on wet earth may smoke more, lose heat, or struggle with damp fuel. A fire placed in a low wet spot could be difficult to maintain. Dry ground near fire could become precious space. People may have had to decide which areas were for sleeping, which were for fuel, which were for drying hides, and which were too wet to use. In a small shelter, these decisions could determine whether the whole group slept warmer or spent the night shifting away from dampness. This is why the floor of a shelter matters as much as the roof. A shelter that blocks rain but leaves people lying in wet cold is incomplete. It reduces one danger while leaving another. For early humans, the full problem was three-dimensional. Water from above, wind from the side, cold from below, and moisture carried by the body itself. To stay dry, they had to think with the whole body. Where will rain drip? Where will smoke move? Where will feet bring snow? Where will children sleep? Where will the ground stay cold longest? A dry night began before anyone lay down. It began with choosing, clearing, layering, raising, warming, and watching the ground beneath the body. To sleep a little warmer, early humans needed distance from the wet ground. That distance did not have to be high. It did not have to look like a bed. Even a thin layer of dry material could change how the body met the earth. Leaves, grasses, reeds, bark, brush, small branches, animal hides, and other available materials could be placed beneath sleepers to slow the loss of heat. These layers worked by trapping air, reducing direct contact with damp soil, and making the sleeping place less likely to soak the body from below. In endless rain and snow, this was not a decorative comfort. It was one of the quiet technologies of survival. A sleeping layer made from plants may sound simple, but it required judgment. Wet leaves are not helpful in the same way dry leaves are. Rotten plant matter can hold moisture. Fresh green branches may contain water. Dry grasses can insulate, but they can also burn if placed carelessly near fire. Bark can shed some moisture, but it may curl or break. Brush can lift the body slightly, but if arranged poorly, it may be uncomfortable or allow cold air through. Early humans had to know which materials stayed useful, where to find them, how to keep them dry, and when to replace them. The value was not in the material alone, it was in the choice and arrangement. Animal hides could add another layer, but again, only if used wisely. A hide beneath the body could block some dampness and hold warmth, especially if there was dry plant material under it, but a hide placed directly on wet soil might become damp from below. A hide compressed under body weight may trap less air than one wrapped around the body. A fur side facing one way might feel warmer, while another arrangement might shed moisture better. We should not pretend to know every method used in every ancient group, but the basic problem is clear. The body needed separation from the ground, and hides were one possible part of that separation. The best bedding may have been layered rather than single. A few branches might lift the sleeping area. Dry grass or leaves might fill the gaps. A hide might cover the top. Another hide might wrap the body. The exact combination would depend on environment. In a forest, plant materials might be more available. In open, cold landscapes, hides, bones, stones, or sparse brush might matter more. Near river valleys, reeds could be useful. Near rocky places, natural ledges might provide a drier surface. The important point is that early humans could use the landscape to create a small zone where the body was not pressed directly into wet cold. This zone might be temporary, rebuilt often, and invisible to us today, but during the night it could make the difference between shivering and sleeping. Raised surfaces also mattered. A person does not need a high platform to gain protection. Even sleeping on branches, brush, stones arranged with care, or a natural rock shelf can reduce contact with wet soil. In some conditions, lifting fuel, hides, or bedding off the ground would also help keep them usable. A small raised area near a shelter wall, under an overhang, or beside a fire could become the driest part of the camp. Children, injured people, or elders might be placed there first. The group's idea of comfort was likely tied closely to protection, not soft luxury, but less dampness, less cold, and fewer interruptions in sleep. Dry layers also had to be protected from people themselves. Feet could bring mud or snow into a sleeping area. Wet hides could dampen dry bedding. Meltwater from snow could run under a layer if the ground sloped badly. Fire could dry bedding, but sparks could destroy it. Smoke might help preserve or dry some materials, but too much smoke made breathing difficult. Every solution created another detail to manage. This is why staying dry in early human life was not a one-time task done before sleep. It was an evening rhythm. Gather dry material, shake off snow, move wet things away, place bodies carefully, protect the fire, keep the driest layers for the most vulnerable, and watch whether water begins to enter. A dry, sleeping layer also preserved energy. When the body loses less heat to the ground, it spends less energy defending its core temperature. Better sleep means better movement the next day. Better warmth means clearer judgment. Clearer judgment means better choices about travel, fire, hunting, gathering, and shelter. So the simple act of putting leaves, grass, brush, or hide beneath the body connects directly to the survival of the whole group. It is not a small domestic detail outside the main story. It is part of how early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow. They did not only build upward against the sky, they built downward against the earth, placing a thin, human-made boundary between warm life and wet ground. A slightly drier night could change the next day. That may sound small, but for early humans living through long rain and snow, small differences often carried large consequences. If the body slept on damp ground, it might wake cold, stiff, and unrested. If the body slept on a layer of dry grass, brush, bark, or hide, even imperfectly protected, it might wake with a little more warmth saved, a little more strength kept, and a little more attention available. Staying dry was not only about surviving one night, it was about preserving the ability to move, gather, hunt, care for children, repair coverings, and make decisions after the storm had passed. Sleep is not an empty pause in human life. It restores the body and helps the mind remain steady. In cold, wet conditions, poor sleep could become a hidden danger. A person who spends the night shivering does not simply lose comfort, they lose energy. They may wake slower, less patient, less coordinated, and less able to notice small problems. A wet sleeping place could make the morning harder before the day even began. For early humans, that mattered because the next day might require walking across wet ground, searching for fuel, carrying a child, following animal tracks, collecting plants, or rebuilding shelter. A body weakened by a cold night had fewer reserves for all of these tasks. This connects directly to the question of how early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow. They were not only protecting the present moment, They were protecting tomorrow's ability to act. A dry sleeping layer, a sheltered fire, or a place raised slightly above mud helped the group keep its strength across time. If one night of wet cold was difficult, many nights could become dangerous. A season of dampness could slowly wear people down. The body might fight cold again and again, spending energy that could have been used for movement, healing, pregnancy, childcare, or tool-making. Dryness was therefore a form of stored energy. Every bit of warmth not lost to the ground was warmth the body did not have to replace. The health of the group was also involved. Children, elders, injured people, and anyone already tired would have been more vulnerable to cold, wet nights. A strong adult might endure discomfort and still move the next morning, but a child who slept badly could become weak or difficult to carry. An injured person lying on damp ground might recover more slowly. An older person with less strength might lose warmth faster than others. This meant that choosing the driest sleeping places was not just practical, it was social. The group had to decide who needed protection most. The best patch of ground, the warmest place near the fire, or the driest hide may have gone first to those whose bodies could not fight the cold as well. This kind of care is part of the real story of staying dry. It reminds us that survival was not only muscle and tools. It was also attention to fragile bodies. Even the arrangement of people during sleep could matter. Bodies close together can share warmth, but they also need space from smoke, sparks, wet edges, and dripping places. A group might cluster near a fire, but not so close that coverings burned. They might keep children in the center, away from wind. They might place damp materials nearer the edge, and dry materials closer to sleepers. They might wake during the night to tend embers or adjust a covering as rain shifted. None of this needs to be imagined as a perfect system. It was probably uneven, tiring, and sometimes unsuccessful. But these small arrangements helped turn a wet place into a slightly safer place. The difference between wet and dry was rarely absolute. Early humans did not need to be completely dry to survive every night. They needed to be dry enough for the fire to remain, dry enough for children to sleep, dry enough for hides to keep some warmth, dry enough for feet and hands to recover, dry enough for the group to wake and continue. That phrase, dry enough, may be one of the most honest answers to the whole question. Endless rain and snow did not require perfect comfort. They required repeated reductions of harm. A little less water beneath the body, a little less wind across the skin, a little less snow melting into bedding, a little more warmth saved before morning. So the ground beneath early humans was not a passive background. It was part of the struggle. To stay dry, they had to manage the sky, the shelter, the fire, the hide, and the earth under their own weight. When they made a sleeping place even slightly drier, they were not only making a bed, they were protecting the next breath of the group's life. Fire was not only warmth. In endless rain and snow, fire was a drying force, and that made it one of the most important protections early humans could have. A flame could not stop the sky from raining. It could not make a soaked landscape suddenly safe. It could not turn a rough shelter into a sealed room, but it could change the small area around the group. It could dry hair after snow had melted into it. It could warm cold hands until they could work again. It could help damp hides, release moisture. It could make a sleeping place less wet than the ground beyond the shelter. It could turn a night of cold stillness into a place where bodies, tools, fuel and coverings slowly returned toward use. This matters because staying dry was never only about blocking water. It was also about recovering after water had already entered. A person caught in rain might reach shelter wet. A hide might become damp while walking. Snow might melt from shoulders and feet. Fuel might be gathered with moisture inside it. The ground near the shelter might already be cold and wet. In that situation, the question was not only how to avoid wetness, but how to remove it, reduce it, and keep it from spreading. Fire answered that problem imperfectly, but powerfully. It gave early humans a center around which drying could begin. Animal hides especially needed this kind of care. A hide that became wet could lose some of its warmth, grow heavy, and become uncomfortable against the body. Near fire, but not too close, it could begin to dry. This required attention. Too far away, and the dampness might remain. Too close, and the hide could scorch, stiffen, shrink, or be damaged. People had to learn the right distance, the right angle, and the right timing. They had to turn materials, move them, protect them from sparks, and avoid letting smoke or flame ruin what they needed for the next day. Fire was useful because it dried, but it also demanded respect. The same heat that saved a covering could destroy it if handled carelessly. Fire also helped dry the body itself. Wet hair, cold fingers, damp feet, and chilled skin all changed near warmth. Hands that had lost feeling could regain enough movement to tie, scrape, carry, or repair. Feet that had been wet could warm before sleep. A person who had shivered under a damp wrap could sit near the flame and slowly recover. This recovery was not just comfort, it restored function. Early humans needed working hands to maintain shelter, prepare food, care for children, and handle tools. In cold rain and snow, a body that could not warm itself again became less able to solve the next problem. Fire gave the body another chance. The sleeping area could also be changed by fire. Heat from a hearth could dry the air nearby, warm stones or ground, and reduce dampness in the immediate space. It did not make everything dry. A cave could remain damp. A shelter edge could still drip. The ground beyond the fire could still be cold. But near the hearth, moisture behaved differently. Hides could be hung or laid nearby. Fuel could be placed where it might dry before being burned. People could arrange themselves so the most vulnerable bodies received warmth first. A fire created a small weather system inside the larger weather. Outside, rain or snow continued. Inside the shelter, close to the flame, there was a pocket of drying, warmth, smoke, and watchfulness. Smoke may also have played a role in how materials lasted, though we should be careful. Smoke can help dry or preserve some organic materials under certain conditions, but it can also irritate eyes and lungs, fill a shelter, and make a place hard to occupy. Early humans had to balance warmth, drying, and ventilation. A fire in a closed space could become dangerous because of smoke. A fire in an open space could be weakened by wind and rain. This means fire was not separate from shelter design. The place of the hearth, the direction of wind, the shape of the entrance, and the path of smoke all mattered. Staying dry around fire required arranging space so heat could help without making the shelter unlivable. The deepest value of fire was that it turned wetness from a final condition into something that could be worked against. Without fire, a soaked hide might remain cold for too long. Damp feet might stay cold through the night. Wet fuel might never become useful. With fire, people had a process. Warm, dry, turn, protect, wait, and use again. This process took time and care. It depended on fuel, shelter, and cooperation. But it gave early humans a way to answer rain and snow after they had already arrived. Fire was not merely light in the dark. It was the slow return of usefulness to a wet world. Keeping fire alive in wet weather was not only the task of one clever person. It was a social skill, because fire depended on many small acts that could not always be done alone. Someone had to find fuel that was not completely soaked. Someone had to protect embers from rain or snow. Someone had to notice when smoke changed direction. Someone had to move damp hides away from sparks. Someone had to keep children from stepping too close. Someone had to wake in the night when the flame weakened. In endless rain and snow, fire was not a thing people simply had. It was a relationship the group maintained. Without care, it could vanish quickly. With care, it became a center of warmth, drying, sleep, and protection. Wet fuel made the work harder. Wood lying on open ground after rain may burn poorly or smoke heavily. Branches under dense cover might stay drier. Dead wood still standing may be more useful than wood lying in mud. Bark, dry grass, inner wood, resinous material, or sheltered twigs could matter depending on the environment. Early humans did not need modern chemistry to understand these differences. They could learn by repeated experience. This kind smokes too much when damp. This branch burns better. This place keeps fuel drier. This wood must be dried near the fire before it can burn well. Such knowledge belonged not only to the person who lit the flame, but to anyone who gathered, carried, stored, or protected fuel. The placement of fire was also a group decision, even if no formal discussion happened. A hearth needed to be close enough to warm bodies and dry materials, but not so close that sparks damaged hides or sleeping places. It needed some protection from wind, but enough airflow that smoke did not trap people inside. It needed ground that was not too wet, and space where fuel could be kept ready. In rain or snow, the wrong placement could mean a smoky shelter, a dying flame, wet bedding, or dangerous sparks. A good placement turned fire into part of the shelter itself. The flame, the windbreak, the roof edge, the sleeping layer, and the entrance all had to work together. Fire also created a rhythm of responsibility through the night. A fire left alone might burn down. Embers might need covering, feeding, or shifting. Damp fuel might need to be placed near warmth before being added. A sudden change in wind might push smoke towards sleepers. Rain might begin dripping from a new place. Snow might slide from a covering. In such moments, the group's survival depended on someone noticing. This does not mean people were always awake and comfortable. They must have been tired, cold, and imperfect. But if fire was central to drying and warmth, then watching it became part of care. The person who tended fire was also tending the bodies around it. Children make this social nature even clearer. A child cannot manage wetness in the same way an adult can. A child may fall asleep too close to smoke, kick away a covering, or fail to understand the danger of wet cold. Keeping a child dry near fire required others to arrange space, share hides, move bedding, and maintain warmth. The same was true for injured, sick, or older people. Fire was not simply for whoever sat nearest it. It had to be distributed through choices. Who sleeps closest? What gets dried first? Which hide is saved from sparks? Which fuel is kept for later? Who wakes when the night grows colder? In this way, fire reveals that staying dry was a group achievement. There is also the matter of memory. A group that had survived many wet seasons would remember what worked. They might remember where good fuel could be found after rain. They might return to a shelter where smoke escaped well. They might know which materials should be gathered before a storm, not after. They might teach children, through ordinary practice, how to place wood, how to keep snow away from embers, how to turn a hide without burning it, how to respect the dangerous edge of flame. This teaching did not need formal lessons. It could happen through watching and doing. Social knowledge lived in routine. Fire connected many parts of the wet weather problem. It dried hides, warmed bodies, protected sleep, helped prepare food, and made some shelter spaces more livable. But because fire could fail, it required cooperation. One person might start it, but the group kept it meaningful. In endless rain and snow, the flame was not just an object at the center of camp. It was a shared responsibility around which people organized time, space, and attention. To keep dry, early humans had to keep warmth alive. To keep warmth alive, they had to keep each other involved. A long rainy night could make fire the center of everything. During the day, people could move, search, carry, repair, and choose. But at night, when rain continued and the ground stayed cold, the world became smaller. The useful space might shrink to the circle around a hearth, the dry side of a rock shelter, the place where hides were hung, the spot where children slept, and the few pieces of fuel kept away from wet ground. In that small space, fire was not simply one helpful thing among many. It became the point around which the group arranged its bodies, materials, and hope of morning. Without fire, a shelter could remain dark, damp, and cold. With fire, even imperfectly, the night could be worked on. This does not mean fire made the night easy. A wet storm could still push smoke into the shelter. Fuel could still burn badly. Rain could still drip from a stone edge. Snow could still melt from hides and feet. People could still shiver, wake, shift position, and wait for the weather to pass. But fire gave them a center of response. If a hide was damp, it could be moved nearer the warmth. If hands were cold, they could be held toward the flame. If a child woke chilled, the child could be brought closer. If fuel was wet, some pieces could be placed near heat to dry before being burned. Fire turned the night from passive suffering into a series of small actions. A long rain also tested the order of the shelter. The driest fuel had to be protected. The sleeping layer had to be kept from dripping water. Hides had to be placed where they could dry without burning. People had to avoid blocking smoke while still staying near warmth. The fire itself had to be fed carefully, because wasting fuel early in the night could leave too little before dawn. This required patience. A large flame might feel comforting for a moment, but a steady fire could matter more. Embers could be as important as flames, because they carried heat forward. In wet weather, the future of the fire was always part of the present. The group had to think not only of warmth now, but of warmth later. Around that fire, early humans would have experienced dryness as something gradual. A wet hide does not become dry at once. Cold feet do not warm instantly. Damp air does not disappear. The change is slow. Moisture lifts. Steam may rise. Smoke moves. The surface of a hide changes from heavy to less heavy. Hands regain feeling. A sleeping place near the hearth becomes a little more bearable. This slow pace matters for sleep audio because it is close to the true rhythm of survival in cold, wet weather. There was no sudden victory over rain and snow. There was only the patient keeping of heat against the pressure of water. Fire also made time visible. In darkness, the flame showed whether the night was stable or failing. A strong glow meant fuel was still present. Weak embers meant someone had to act. Smoke changing direction meant wind had shifted. Sparks landing too near a hide meant a covering had to be moved. A new drip near the hearth meant water was finding a path inside. The fire helped people see the condition of their shelter. It revealed the movements of air and water. It showed where drying was possible and where dampness was winning. In this way, the hearth was not only warmth, it was information. It told the group what the weather was doing inside their small, protected world. The emotional meaning of fire should also be understood carefully. We do not need to invent dramatic scenes to recognize that warmth and light affect the human mind. A cold, wet night can make people quiet, tense, and tired. A living fire can steady attention. It can gather people close enough to share warmth and notice one another. It can make the shelter feel less like an exposed place and more like a temporary center. For early humans, this mattered because survival depended on clear enough thinking to continue small tasks when the body wanted only to sleep. Fire helped hold the group in a pattern of care. It gave people a reason to remain organized through the night. Yet fire was never separate from the larger question of staying dry. It depended on shelter, fuel, ground, and people. A flame in open rain could vanish. A hearth on wet ground could struggle. A shelter without smoke escape could become hard to breathe in. A group without enough dry fuel could lose its warmth before morning. So the long rainy night teaches a deeper lesson. No single protection was enough. Fire became central because it connected all the others. It dried hides, warmed bodies, protected sleep, revealed leaks, demanded fuel, shaped the shelter, and required cooperation. In endless rain and snow, the flame was not just heat. It was the living center of a system that kept wetness from taking everything at once. Staying dry did not begin only after people stopped for the night. It began while they were still moving. Early humans did not walk through rain, snow, and wet ground as if the landscape were the same in every direction. The route itself mattered. A path through a low marshy place could soak feet and legs. A ridge might expose the body to wind but drain water more quickly. A forest edge might slow rain but drip afterward. A river crossing could wet the body deeply and make the rest of the day colder. A sheltered valley might protect from wind but hold damp air. Movement was never only movement. It was a series of choices about how much water the body would carry into the next hour. The timing of travel also mattered. In wet weather, when people moved could be as important as where they moved. Walking during heavy rain could soak coverings and make fire starting harder later. Waiting too long could mean losing daylight, losing a chance to reach shelter, or becoming trapped by rising water or deeper snow. Moving during a brief break in weather might allow the group to reach a better overhang, gather drier fuel, or cross a difficult patch before the next storm. Early humans did not have forecasts in the modern sense, but they had sky, wind, clouds, temperature, animal behavior, memory of seasons, and the feel of changing air. Their decisions were probably based on observation, not certainty, but observation was enough to make some choices better than others. The question of how early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow therefore includes travel strategy. If a group arrived at camp already soaked, the night became harder. If they reached shelter with some coverings still dry, some fuel still usable, and children not fully chilled, the night began with more hope. Choosing a route that avoided deep wet ground could protect feet. Stopping before darkness could allow time to gather bedding and arrange hides. Delaying movement during a storm could prevent exhaustion. Continuing movement when the body was already cold could be dangerous. But stopping in the wrong place could be worse. Every choice carried risk. Staying dry meant balancing those risks with the body's limits in mind. Terrain became a tool. A slope that shed water was useful. A line of rocks could break wind. A patch of trees could slow falling snow. A dry bank above a river could offer a safer stop than the muddy low edge. A south-facing or sun-exposed place, depending on region and season, might dry faster than a shaded hollow. Gravel or sand might drain better than thick mud. These details are easy to overlook, but they are exactly the kind of knowledge that makes the title meaningful. Early humans stayed drier not only by making things, but by reading landforms as protection. The landscape itself had dry and wet tendencies, and survival depended on knowing the difference. Snow travel added its own decisions. Deep snow slows movement and increases effort. Effort produces sweat. Sweat can become cold when movement stops. Wet snow can cling to feet and coverings, then melt near warmth. Wind-blown snow can enter every gap in clothing or shelter. A group moving through snow had to think about distance, pace, rest, and exposure. A faster pace might reach shelter sooner but cause more sweating. A slower pace might conserve energy but keep bodies exposed longer. Resting in open snow could chill people quickly. Resting under cover might allow snow to be brushed off before it melted. Again, staying dry was not simply staying out of falling snow. It was managing the chain from movement to sweat to rest to drying. These travel choices were not only individual, the group moved at the speed of its vulnerable members. Children, elders, injured people, or anyone carrying heavy loads changed what routes were possible. A dry high path might be too difficult. A sheltered low path might be wetter but safer from wind. A river crossing might be possible for strong adults, but dangerous for children. If one person became soaked or exhausted, the whole group might have to stop sooner. This meant that travel in rain and snow was a social calculation. The driest choice for one body might not be the safest choice for the group. A good decision had to preserve enough strength for everyone to reach shelter and recover. The deeper lesson is that early humans did not only respond to weather after it struck them, they anticipated it through movement. They avoided some wet places, accepted others, paused when needed, hurried when useful, and returned to known shelters when memory guided them. Their protection began before the shelter, before the fire, before the bedding. It began with the route taken across wet land. In endless rain and snow, every step could either add moisture to the body or help keep it away. To stay dry was to travel with attention, knowing that the night's warmth might depend on the path chosen long before sunset. The land itself could be used like a tool against wet weather. Early humans did not need to change the whole landscape. They needed to notice which parts of it helped the body stay a little drier, a little warmer, and a little less exposed. A ridge, a slope, a stand of trees, a rock wall, a riverbank, a gravel patch, or the sheltered side of a hill could all affect how rain, snow, and wind reached the body. In endless rain and snow, geography was not background. It was part of survival. To move well through wet country, people had to read the shape of the land almost as carefully as they read animal tracks or the condition of a fire. Avoiding wind was one of the most important uses of terrain. Wind turns wetness into a stronger danger. It pushes rain sideways, drives snow into openings, cools damp skin, and strips warmth from coverings. The windward side of a ridge or open slope might be harsh even if the ground was firm. The lee side of a hill, a boulder, a tree line, or a cliff could offer relief. The air might still be cold, but it would strike the body less directly. A group that stopped behind natural cover could protect fire more easily, arrange hides with less flapping, and reduce the cooling force on sleeping bodies. This was not comfort in a modern sense. It was a small reduction in heat loss, but that reduction could matter through a long wet night. Avoiding flooded or water-holding ground was just as important. Low places collect water. Hollows gather mud. River edges can become unstable after rain. Snowmelt can run through places that seemed dry earlier. Wet meadows, marshes, and muddy depressions can soak feet and make movement slow. Once feet are wet, the whole body may become harder to keep warm, especially after stopping. Early humans had to learn where water collected after storms. A low route might be easier in dry weather, but punishing in rain. A slightly higher path might take more effort, but keep feet and bedding materials drier. The best route was not always the shortest route. Sometimes it was the route that brought the least wetness into the body by nightfall. Slopes offered another kind of protection because they drain. Water moves downward, and ground that sheds water can become usable sooner than flat places. A gentle slope near a shelter might keep bedding from lying in pooled rain. A raised bank could provide a drier place for fuel. A natural shelf on rock might stay dry while soil below remained soaked. But slopes also had limits. Too steep, and they were difficult for rest. Too exposed, and wind could undo the benefit of drainage. Early humans had to balance drainage with shelter. Shelter with smoke, smoke with fire, and fire with sleep. Terrain was useful because it gave options, not because it solved everything by itself. Different surfaces behave differently under rain and snow. Gravel may drain better than clay. Sand may dry faster than mud. Rock may shed water but become cold and hard. Moss may feel soft but hold moisture. Leaf litter may insulate if dry, but chill if soaked. Snow on open ground may drift, while snow under trees may fall later in wet clumps. These details would have mattered because the body touched the land constantly, through feet, hands, sleeping layers, fuel storage, and shelter placement. To stay dry, early humans had to learn not only what the sky was doing, but what the ground would do afterward. The best place during a storm might not be the best place after a thaw. The best path in snow might become a stream of meltwater later. Using terrain as a tool also meant planning where to stop before exhaustion. A group could look for a place where several advantages came together. Overhead cover, reduced wind, draining ground, nearby fuel, enough space for sleeping, and a safe way to leave. Such places would have been remembered. Over time, familiar landscapes could become maps of wet weather choices. This overhang is good in rain but smoky with fire. That bank stays dry unless the river rises. Those trees block wind but drip all night. That slope drains quickly but catches snow. This kind of memory is deeply connected to the title. Early humans stayed dry not by controlling weather, but by remembering where weather was less damaging. There is humility in this kind of knowledge. It does not look like a dramatic invention. It looks like choosing the better side of a hill. It looks like walking above a muddy hollow. It looks like sleeping, where water runs away instead of toward the body. It looks like placing fuel on stones instead of wet ground. It looks like turning a shelter opening away from wind when possible. These small choices may be invisible in the archaeological record, but they belong to the daily intelligence of survival. In endless rain and snow, the landscape was full of partial answers. Early humans stayed drier by finding them, using them, and remembering them. Sometimes the most important way to stay dry was to decide whether to move at all. Movement could save a group from a wet place, but it could also make the body wetter, colder, and more tired. Staying could protect a fire, preserve a dry sleeping layer, and allow damp hides to dry. But staying too long in the wrong place could mean running out of fuel, food, or safer ground. Early humans living through rain and snow had to make this decision again and again: remain where conditions were partly controlled, or leave and risk exposure. This was not a simple choice between courage and fear. It was a practical judgment about water, cold, strength, daylight, and the bodies of everyone in the group. If a shelter was already working, leaving it during heavy rain could be costly. A group might have a fire protected from wind, bedding that was not fully soaked, hides drying near warmth, and children finally resting. To step back into rain could undo much of that work. Coverings might become wet again. Feet might sink into mud or snow. Fuel gathered with effort might be left behind. The body might begin to sweat under wraps while walking, then chill when stopping later. In this case, staying put could be the wiser way to stay dry. The shelter did not need to be perfect. If it was good enough to keep the group warmer and less wet than open ground, remaining there could preserve energy. But staying had dangers too. A dry place could become wet if rain continued. A stream might rise. Wind might shift and drive rain into the entrance. Fuel might run low. Smoke might build if the shelter was poorly ventilated. A location that was safe for one night might become difficult after several. Snow might pile near an opening or melt into the sleeping area. If people stayed too long in a place where water was slowly winning, they could become weaker each day. So the choice to leave could also be a form of staying dry. Moving toward higher ground, a better overhang, more fuel, or a known winter stop could reduce danger later, even if the journey itself was wet. Timing made the decision sharper. Leaving too late could mean traveling in darkness, when wet ground, cold air, and hidden obstacles became harder to manage. Leaving too early, during the worst of rain or wind, could soak the group before they reached a better place. Waiting for a pause in weather may have been one of the quiet skills of survival. A break in the rain could allow people to move hides, gather dry wood, cross a stream, or reach a more sheltered location. Early humans did not have clocks or weather reports, but they had repeated experience. They could watch clouds, wind, light, animal movement, and the feel of the air. They could remember how storms behaved in certain seasons. Their decisions were uncertain but not blind. The needs of the group shaped the answer. A strong adult might be able to travel wet and recover later. A child, an injured person, or an elder might not. A pregnant woman, a sick person, or someone carrying a heavy load changed what was safe. If the group moved, everyone moved through the same weather, but not everybody paid the same cost. This meant that the decision to stay or go was also a decision about care. The driest choice for the strongest person might not be the safest choice for the whole group. Staying dry meant preserving the group's ability to remain together, not only protecting one body from rain. There was no perfect rule. A familiar shelter might be worth returning to. A poor shelter might be worth abandoning before night. A storm might force people to wait. A shortage of fuel might force them to leave. A thaw might turn snow into flowing water. A cold snap might make wet ground hard but safer to cross. The same landscape could give different answers on different days. This is why early human survival depended on flexible knowledge rather than fixed solutions. They had to ask, in their own way, what is the weather doing now? What will the ground become later? How tired are we? What is still dry? What can be carried? And what will happen if we wait? The decision to stay or move was part of the technology of dryness. It did not look like a tool, but it worked like one. It protected hides from unnecessary soaking. It protected feet from wet crossings. It protected fire from being lost too soon. It protected children from exposure beyond their strength. It protected tomorrow by not spending all of today's energy in cold rain. In endless rain and snow, early humans stayed dry not only with coverings, shelters, fire, and dry bedding, but with restraint. They survived by knowing that every step into weather had a cost, and every hour of waiting had a cost too. Between those costs, they searched for the narrow moment when moving or staying gave the body its best chance to remain warm enough, dry enough, and able to continue. In cold rain and snow, not every body faced the same danger. A strong adult could sometimes keep moving through wet ground, generate heat by walking, carry a damp hide, or stay awake to tend a fire. But a child could not always do that. An older person might not recover warmth as quickly. Someone injured, sick, hungry, pregnant, or exhausted might become cold sooner and think less clearly. This is why staying dry was never only an individual problem. It was a group problem, shaped by the most vulnerable bodies near the fire. If early humans wanted the group to survive through wet seasons, they had to protect those who could not protect themselves as well. Children made this need obvious. A small body can lose heat quickly, and a child may not recognize the danger early enough. A child may keep playing near wet ground, fall asleep against damp bedding, kick away a covering, or walk into snow without understanding how long the cold will remain afterward. Infants and very young children depend almost completely on others for warmth, placement, wrapping, and dryness. In endless rain and snow, this meant that adults had to think for bodies that could not yet make safe decisions. A dry patch near the center of shelter, a hide wrapped more carefully, a place away from the drip line, or a position closer to shared warmth could become a quiet act of protection. Older people also mattered deeply. A person who had lived through many seasons might carry valuable memory, where water collected, which overhangs stayed dry, how smoke moved in a known shelter, where fuel could still be found after rain. But an older body might move more slowly or suffer more during a wet journey. If the group valued that memory, it also had to protect the person who carried it. Staying dry, then, was not only about preserving strength for hunting or travel. It was also about preserving knowledge. A dry sleeping place for an elder could mean that the group kept access to years of remembered weather. The weak, injured, or sick created another layer of care. A person with a hurt foot might not avoid puddles easily. Someone feverish or exhausted might not manage wet coverings well. A person who had eaten too little might have less energy to stay warm. These conditions would make wet cold more dangerous. In a harsh season, the group may not always have had enough dry material for everyone. Choices had to be made. Who needed the best hide? Who slept closest to the fire? Who stayed under the overhang while others gathered fuel? Who could travel, and who needed rest? These were not abstract moral questions. They were practical questions about whether the group would remain whole. This connects directly to how early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow. The answer was not only in objects, it was in care. A hide could be shared, a child could be carried across wet ground, a sleeping layer could be given to someone who would lose heat quickly, wet feet could be warmed before sleep, a tired person could be placed where wind struck less strongly. These actions may leave no archaeological trace, yet they are consistent with the basic needs of human bodies and the social nature of human survival. To stay dry was to notice who was becoming cold before that cold became dangerous. The shelter itself may have been organized around vulnerability. The driest center might be reserved for children. The edge near wind and dripping water might be used for tools, wet hides, or stronger adults who could wake and adjust things. The fire might be tended by those able to stay alert, while weaker bodies rested closer to warmth. A group sleeping together was not random. It could become a living arrangement of heat, dryness, smoke, and care. People were not simply bodies lying in a shelter. They were a pattern of protection around those who needed it most. In this way, wet weather reveals something important about early human life. Survival was not only the triumph of the strongest person. A group that ignored its vulnerable members would lose children, memory, and trust. A group that learned to protect them gained continuity. The child who stayed warm through a wet night could grow into an adult who remembered how it was done. The elder kept dry enough to wake clearly could guide the group toward a better shelter. The injured person who survived could return strength later. In endless rain and snow, dryness became a shared resource, and the fairest use of that resource was often the most practical one. Early humans stayed dry by building barriers against water, but also by building circles of attention around fragile life. Sharing warmth was one of the ways early humans shared life. In endless rain and snow, no person could control every part of survival alone. One person might know where fuel stayed drier. Another might be better at arranging branches against wind. Another might keep watch when the fire weakened. Another might carry a child, repair a hide, shake snow from bedding, or move wet materials away from the sleeping place. The work of staying dry was spread across the group because the danger was spread across the group. Rain did not fall on only one person. Snow did not chill only one pair of hands. Damp ground did not threaten only one sleeper. The whole camp had to be managed as a shared body. Fire shows this clearly. A fire could warm many people, but only if many small responsibilities were held together. Fuel had to be gathered before it was needed. Damp wood had to be dried near the flame. Embers had to be protected from sudden rain or falling snow. Smoke had to be watched. Children had to be kept from sparks. Hides had to be placed close enough to dry, but not close enough to burn. If one person slept while another tended the fire, warmth moved through trust. The flame did not belong only to the hands that fed it. It belonged to everyone who depended on it. In this sense, fire was not only a tool, it was a social center where warmth, attention, and responsibility met. Coverings were also shared resources. A hide might be wrapped around one person while walking, then used beneath a child at night, then hung near an entrance when wind shifted. A dry hide might be more urgently needed by someone weak than by someone still warm from movement. A damp hide might need to be dried before anyone could use it safely. If materials were limited, the group had to decide how to use them. These decisions may not have been spoken in formal words. They could happen through habit, gesture, and repeated practice. But the meaning was clear. No covering was only an object. It was a piece of protection that could move from body to body, from ground to shelter, from present need to future need. Repairing shelter was another shared task. Rain finds small openings. Snow gathers where a cover sags. Wind loosens branches and pulls at hides. A drip that begins at the edge of a shelter can slowly soak the sleeping place. One person might notice it. Another might move a stone. Another might lift a branch. Someone else might shift bedding away from the wet edge. These small actions could keep the night from becoming worse. A shelter was not finished when it was first made. In wet weather, it had to be maintained. It had to be watched as the storm changed. This work was easier when the group acted together, because water could enter from many directions at once. Weather itself had to be watched. Clouds, wind, temperature, dripping stone, rising water, melting snow, and changing smoke all gave information. A group that noticed these signs early could protect dry materials before they were lost. They could gather fuel before heavy rain. They could move bedding before meltwater spread. They could leave a failing place before exhaustion made travel harder. This was community knowledge, not only private instinct. People learned from one another where to stand, where not to sleep, which hides needed drying, how close to place fuel, and when the shelter was no longer safe enough. In this way, staying dry became a shared memory, passed through ordinary behavior. The quiet truth is that early humans did not survive wet cold by standing alone against weather. They survived by making the weather smaller together. One person could not be awake forever. One hide could not cover everyone. One fire could not protect a badly placed camp. One shelter could not repair itself. But a group could divide attention. A group could protect the vulnerable. A group could remember which place failed in last season's rain. A group could keep warmth alive while some slept. That shared effort was part of the answer to the title. Early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow, not only by using skin, stone, wood, and fire, but by turning those materials into a pattern of care. Dryness was something they made together. One watched flame, one moved hide, one repaired shelter edge, and one protected sleeping child at a time. Staying dry was not the invention of one person. It was more likely a way of living that grew through repeated experience. One person may have discovered a better way to angle a hide. Another may have remembered which overhang stayed dry. Another may have learned how to keep embers alive in damp weather. And another may have noticed that children slept warmer away from the shelter edge. But these discoveries mattered most when they became group habits. A useful act done once could help one night. A useful act repeated, taught, and remembered could help many seasons. In endless rain and snow, survival depended on this slow movement from experience into custom. Group habits do not need to be loud or formal. A child learns by watching where adults place bedding. A young person learns which branches are gathered before rain. Someone learns not to bring snow-covered hides too close to the sleeping area. Someone learns to keep fuel off wet ground. Someone learns that the driest part of a shelter is not always the deepest part. These lessons can pass without explanation. They live in hands, posture, timing, and repeated correction. Over time, the group develops a shared sense of what to do when the sky darkens, when wind changes, when snow begins to melt, or when the fire grows weak. That shared sense is a kind of technology, even if it leaves no artifact behind. This matters because the archaeology of wet weather survival is incomplete. Stone tools may survive, bones may survive, hearths may leave traces, but the habit of shaking snow from a hide, the choice to place a child in the center, the memory of a dry slope, or the evening routine of lifting fuel away from damp soil may leave nothing at all. If we only look for objects, we miss part of the answer. Early humans stayed drier through behaviors as much as through things. A shelter is more effective when people know how to use it. A hide is more effective when people know how to dry it. A fire is more effective when people know how to keep it alive. A landscape is more protective when people remember its wet and dry places. The group itself became the carrier of these protections. Over many wet seasons, small errors would have taught hard lessons. A shelter placed in a drainage path might flood. A fire left unprotected might die before morning. A wet hide stored badly might become useless. A child placed too near a draft might wake cold. A group that moved too late might arrive exhausted and soaked. These failures would not always be fatal, but they would be remembered. Human learning often begins in discomfort. The next time, people might choose higher ground, build a stronger windbreak, gather fuel earlier, or dry coverings before sleep. The lesson did not have to be perfect. It only had to reduce the chance of repeating the same harm. In this way, staying dry became cultural. Culture here does not mean decoration or belief alone. It means learned ways of doing things that help a group continue. How to prepare a hide, where to sleep in a shelter, when to move before a storm, how to share warmth, which materials rot, burn, drip, smoke, or insulate. These are cultural facts because they are not born fully inside the body. They are learned from others. They accumulate. A person enters the world helpless against rain, but grows into a group that already knows many partial answers. The body remains vulnerable, but the group's memory surrounds it. This is one reason early humans could live across such different environments. They did not carry one fixed solution everywhere. They carried the ability to learn local solutions together. In one place, dense forest materials might shape shelter. In another, rock overhangs might be central. In another, large animal hides, brush, or bones might matter more. In each place, rain and snow would teach different lessons. The group that survived was the group that paid attention long enough for those lessons to become ordinary. So when we ask how early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow, we should imagine not a single genius moment, but 1,000 repeated evenings. Someone moves fuel away from wet ground. Someone turns a hide. Someone checks the drip line. Someone warms a child's hands. Someone chooses the higher sleeping place. Someone remembers that this valley becomes too wet after thaw. These small acts become the hidden architecture of survival. They form a shelter made not only of branches, skin, and stone, but of memory shared between people. The rain may have been endless, but the answer was also endless. Repeated care, repeated watching, repeated learning, until dryness became something the whole group knew how to seek. Over many seasons of rain and snow, early humans learned by returning to the same problems again and again. A storm came, a shelter leaked, a fire struggled, a hide became damp, a child woke cold, and the group remembered. The next storm did not arrive as a completely new event. It arrived with traces of the last one still living in human memory. This is how practical knowledge grows, not all at once, not as a finished plan, but through repeated contact with the same hard forces: water falling from above, cold rising from the ground, wind entering through gaps, snow melting near warmth, and the body losing heat when it stays wet too long. Observation was the first teacher. People could see that some places stayed drier after rain while others became mud. They could notice that a cave entrance was useful in one wind direction but smoky in another. They could learn that a rock shelf remained dry while the hollow below filled with water. They could see which branches shed rain, which leaves held it, which fuel burned after damp weather, and which fuel only smoked. These were not abstract lessons. They were tied to hunger, sleep, movement, and warmth. A lesson was valuable because it made the next night less dangerous. Repetition turned these observations into confidence. The first time a group chose higher ground after rain, it may have been a guess. After many storms, it became knowledge. The first time someone placed dry brush beneath a sleeper, the result may have been felt as relief. After repeated nights, it became part of preparation. The first time a hide was damaged by being too close to fire, it was a loss. After that, the group could remember the right distance more carefully. In this way, wet weather taught through both success and failure. The body kept score. Warm sleep, working hands, dry fuel, and surviving fire all showed what had helped. This is important because staying dry in endless rain and snow was not one discovery that solved the problem forever. It was an accumulating pattern. Every season could refine it. A group might learn to gather fuel before rain rather than after. They might learn to shake snow from hides before bringing them into a shelter. They might learn that sweat from hard walking could become dangerous when resting, so movement and covering had to be balanced. They might learn which side of a hill gave less wind, which stream crossing became unsafe after snowmelt, and which overhang seemed dry but dripped slowly through the night. And none of these lessons required written language. They required attention, memory, and the ability to pass behavior from one person to another. Children would have grown inside this pattern. They would see adults testing the ground before sleeping, moving bedding away from a drip, turning a hide near fire, or choosing one route instead of another. At first, these acts might seem ordinary. Later, they would become part of the child's own sense of how to live. This is how knowledge becomes quiet. It no longer feels like a new idea. It becomes the way things are done. In a wet world, this quiet knowledge may have been as important as any visible tool. The scraper, the hearth, the hide, and the shelter mattered. But so did knowing when and how to use them. Observation also made early humans sensitive to local differences. Rain in a forest is not the same as snow on open tundra. Wet stone is not the same as muddy soil. A sheltered valley is not the same as a windy ridge. A hide that works well in dry cold may behave differently in wet snow. Early humans could not survive everywhere by repeating one fixed method. They had to let each place teach them. The landscape gave clues, and people who noticed those clues had better chances of staying dry enough to sleep, move, and continue. So by the time we reach this part of the story, the answer to the title has become wider. Early humans stayed dry not because they found one perfect material, one perfect shelter, or one perfect fire. They stayed dry because they learned the behavior of wetness over time. They watched water, wind, ground, flame, hide, and body as parts of one system. They remembered which choices reduced harm. They repeated those choices until they became habit. In endless rain and snow, Survival belonged to those who could notice small differences before the cold made those differences too late. In a wet and cold world, memory became a kind of shelter. Early humans did not only remember where animals moved or where food could be found, they also had to remember which things stayed dry longer, which places held warmth better, and which materials failed when rain or snow lasted too long. A branch shelter that looked strong in dry weather might sag when soaked. A patch of moss that seemed soft might hold cold water. A hide that was useful in dry wind might become heavy after hours of rain. A cave that protected from falling snow might trap damp air or smoke. These differences were not small to the people living inside them. They shaped sleep, movement, fire, and the body's ability to recover. Over time, anything that stayed a little drier became valuable knowledge. A certain overhang might keep its floor dry even after long rain. A certain bank might drain quickly. A certain tree line might block wind without dripping too heavily. A certain kind of bark might shed water for a while. A certain bundle of grass might insulate better when placed under a hide. A certain fuel might still burn after damp weather if kept off the ground. These observations could become part of the group's mental map. The landscape was not remembered only by distance or direction. It was remembered by behavior. Where water ran, where snow collected, where smoke moved, where wind entered, where bodies could sleep with less cold rising from below. The same was true of materials. Some materials keep warmth only when dry. Some lose their value quickly when wet. Some dry faster near fire. Some smoke too much. Some rot. Some bend. Some crack. Some can be tied, folded, layered, or repaired. Early humans had to learn these qualities through use. A hide was not simply a hide. It had thickness, weight, hair, stiffness, smell, damage, and a history of being wet or dried. Wood was not simply wood. Some pieces were damp inside. Some had been protected by bark. Some were too rotten. Some might catch flame only after drying beside the hearth. Plant bedding was not simply bedding. Dry grass could help. Wet grass could harm. A good material was good only in relation to weather, fire, ground, and body. Places with less wind would have been remembered with special care. Wind could turn a manageable wetness into deep chill. It could blow rain under an overhang, push smoke into a shelter, cool damp skin, and make a fire unstable. A camp that blocked wind from one direction might become poor when the wind shifted. This means memory had to be flexible. It was not enough to know that a place was sheltered. People had to know when it was sheltered. A rock face might help in one season. A hollow might be dangerous in another. A forest edge might be useful during falling snow, but wet after thaw. The knowledge of dryness was therefore not simple information. It was timing, direction, and condition. This kind of experience would have been taught quietly. A young person might be told, or simply shown, not to sleep where watermarks stained the stone. Someone might learn to place fuel on dry rock instead of soil. Someone might notice that the driest ground is often not the deepest part of a cave, but the place where air moves and water does not drip. Someone might learn that a hide must be dried before it is stored, or that snow should be brushed away before entering the warm shelter. These are modest lessons, but they answer the central question more honestly than any single invention. Early humans stayed dry by building a library of small, reliable differences. The body made this knowledge urgent. If a group chose wrongly, the result was felt directly. Colder sleep, heavier coverings, numb fingers, wet feet, a weaker fire, less energy in the morning. If they chose well, the reward was also direct. A drier place to lie down, a fire that lasted, a child who slept, a hide that remained usable, a morning that began with less exhaustion. In this way, the environment corrected them. Rain and snow became harsh teachers, but patient ones. The same problems returned often enough for learning to accumulate. We should be careful not to make this sound perfect. Early humans did not always choose the best place. They did not always keep dry. Storms could defeat experience. Materials could fail. A known shelter could be occupied, unsafe, smoky, flooded, or too far away, but the repeated search for what stayed drier, warmer, and more protected was itself a form of intelligence. It transformed random exposure into practiced response. It turned the world into a set of remembered possibilities. By learning which things held dryness longer, early humans were not only solving weather, they were extending memory into the landscape. A dry ledge, a sheltered fire spot, a useful hide, a patch of draining ground, a fuel source under cover. Each became part of the group's survival knowledge. In endless rain and snow, the difference between living exposed and living with skill may have been the ability to remember where the world gave even a little protection, and to return to that protection before the body had lost too much warmth. Progress in early wet weather survival was probably slow. It may not have looked like a sudden invention, a single brilliant shelter, or one perfect piece of clothing. More often, it may have looked like a small correction after a hard night. A shelter cover was angled a little more steeply. A sleeping place was moved away from a drip line. Fuel was stored on stone instead of damp soil. A hide was dried earlier, before darkness. Snow was shaken off before it melted near the fire. A child was placed closer to warmth and farther from the windy edge. Each change may have seemed ordinary, but in endless rain and snow, ordinary changes could carry the weight of survival. The body does not need a perfect world to recover. It needs conditions that are slightly less damaging than before. A little less moisture beneath the back, a little less wind across the neck, a little less snow melting into bedding, a little more dry fuel before morning, a little more warmth saved during sleep. These small improvements may not impress us from a distance, but they are exactly how vulnerable bodies continue through difficult seasons. Early humans stayed dry not because every night became safe, but because repeated details made some nights less dangerous than they would have been. Slow improvement also fits what we know about deep human adaptation. People learn from materials by handling them. They learn from landscapes by returning to them. They learn from weather, because weather repeats with variation. A storm exposes a weakness. A cold morning confirms the cost. A better arrangement reduces the harm next time. Over many generations, these small adjustments become part of the group's normal life. Nobody needs to remember the first person who placed brush under a hide, or the first person who noticed that one overhang stayed drier than another. The knowledge survives because it works. It is repeated because the body feels the difference. There is honesty in this slow picture. It avoids the false idea that early humans mastered nature completely. They did not command rain to stop. They did not make snow harmless. They did not always keep warm. They did not always choose correctly. But they learned how to reduce the power of wetness in the places where reduction mattered most. Around the skin, under the sleeping body, near the fire, inside the shelter, along the route, and within the care of the group, their progress was measured not in comfort, but in continued ability. Could they wake? Could they move? Could they keep the child warm? Could they repair the covering? Could they carry memory into another storm? Each small success gave the next day a chance. This is why the small details should not be treated as background. In a cold, wet world, details are the story. The angle of a hide can decide where water runs. The height of a sleeping layer can decide how much heat is lost to the ground. The placement of fuel can decide whether fire survives the night. The timing of travel can decide whether people arrive soaked or only damp. The choice of a wind-sheltered place can decide whether wet skin chills quickly or slowly. None of these acts alone explains everything. Together, they form the practical intelligence behind the title. How did early humans stay dry in endless rain and snow? They did it by reducing wetness before it became overwhelming, then reducing it again and again and again. Over time, these repeated reductions changed more than the night. They shaped human attention. They taught people to look closely at the world's small signs: a darker patch of stone where water had run, a line of leaves showing wind direction, a smoky fire revealing poor airflow, a stiff hide warning that it had dried badly, a a tired child showing that the night had been too cold. Wet weather trained people to see cause and consequence. It made survival depend on memory, patience, cooperation, and careful timing. So the progress was slow, but it was not small in meaning. Every dry layer, every protected ember, every better stopping place, every remembered shelter was part of a long human answer to rain and snow. Early humans did not step outside the natural world. They stayed inside it, exposed to it, corrected by it, and taught by it. Their achievement was not perfect control. It was learning how to make the next cold night a little less dangerous than the last. Staying dry may seem like a simple problem, but in early human life it reveals a quiet form of intelligence. It was not intelligence shown through monuments, writing, metal, or large machines. It was intelligence close to the skin. It began with noticing that wet ground steals warmth, that wind makes dampness worse, that snow becomes water when it touches heat, that a hide must be dried before it can protect well, that a fire must be shielded before rain reaches it, and that a child placed near the cold edge of a shelter may not sleep safely. These were humble observations, but they were not small. They were the kind of observations that allowed people to wake, move, remember, and continue. When we ask how early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow, we are really asking how the human mind learned to work with ordinary danger. Rain is ordinary, snow is ordinary, damp soil is ordinary. A cold wind entering a shelter is ordinary. But ordinary things can become dangerous when they last too long. Early humans had to recognize that survival was not always about one dramatic moment. It was often about preventing the slow damage that comes from exposure. A wet hide dried before night, a sleeping layer lifted from mud, a fire kept alive through drizzle, a route chosen above flooded ground. These actions show intelligence because they connect cause and consequence. They show the mind looking ahead. They show people understanding that what happens before sleep may decide what the body can do after waking. This kind of intelligence is easily overlooked because it does not always leave strong traces behind. A stone tool may remain, a hearth may leave charcoal, a cave may still be there, but the careful placement of bedding, the shared decision to stay one more night under shelter, the remembered dry bank, the repaired tie on a hide, or the habit of brushing snow away before entering the sleeping space may disappear completely. Yet those lost actions may have mattered as much as the objects we can still find. The history of staying dry is partly a history of things that vanished. Leaves, grass, bark, skin, smoke patterns, hand movements, warnings, habits, and small acts of care. Their disappearance should not make them seem unimportant. It should make us more attentive to the quiet skills that supported life. Early human intelligence also appears in the refusal to depend on one answer. No single protection was enough. A hide helped, but it could become wet. A shelter helped, but it could leak. Fire helped, but it could die. Dry ground helped, but weather could change it. Memory helped, but storms could surprise the group. The real answer was combination. Human beings survived by connecting partial protections into a working pattern. A rock overhang, a windbreak, a fire, dry fuel, prepared hides, raised bedding, shared warmth, and careful timing all supported one another. This is a very human kind of thinking, not expecting one perfect solution, but arranging many imperfect things so that together they reduce harm. That lesson reaches beyond prehistory, though the story must remain grounded in its ancient setting. Early humans living through rain and snow show that intelligence is not only the ability to imagine faraway ideas, it is also the ability to notice what the body needs right now. Warmth, rest, dryness, breathable air, safe ground, a protected flame, a child kept away from the wet edge. These needs are basic, but meeting them required judgment. It required memory of past storms, knowledge of materials, cooperation among people, and sensitivity to small changes in weather. The mind became useful because it served the body. The body survived because the mind learned to protect it. There is something deeply honest in that relationship. Early humans were not above nature. They were inside it. Rain touched them. Snow chilled them. Wind entered their shelters. Mud held their footprints. Their bodies warned them through shivering, pain, fatigue, and relief. They learned because the world corrected them. A failed shelter, a wet sleeping place, a dying fire, or a soaked hide taught lessons that could not be ignored. Slowly, over many generations, these lessons became ways of living. Staying dry became more than avoiding water. It became a pattern of attention to land, weather, material, body, and group. So the humble work of keeping dry tells us something important about human beginnings. Before great buildings, before written records, before many later forms of technology, there was already a careful intelligence at work in the rain. It watched where water moved. It protected warmth. It made use of animal skins, stone edges, branches, fire, and memory. It did not defeat the storm completely. It simply made a small human space inside it, dry enough for sleep, warm enough for morning, and safe enough for the next lesson to be learned. The educational lesson in this story is simple, but it reaches deeply into human life. Survival was never only strength. Strength mattered, of course. A person needed strength to walk through wet ground, carry wood, scrape hides, lift children, move stones, and endure long, cold nights. But strength alone could not keep a fire alive in rain. Strength alone could not know where water would run after a storm. Strength alone could not make a wet hide dry without ruining it, or choose the place where wind would pass less sharply over sleeping bodies. To survive endless rain and snow, early humans needed observation, care, memory, patience, and adaptation. They needed the quieter abilities that let a vulnerable body remain alive, in a world that did not soften itself for them. Observation came first, because weather leaves signs before it becomes dangerous. A darkening sky, a colder wind, a change in smoke, wet marks on stone, mud under leaves, snow beginning to soften near fire, or a child growing still from cold could all become warnings. Early humans had to notice these signs before they turned into larger problems. A group that waited until everything was soaked had fewer choices. A group that noticed early could move fuel, adjust hides, choose higher ground, protect embers, or settle before darkness. This lesson still has value. Many dangers in life are easier to answer when they are noticed early. The old work of staying dry reminds us that intelligence often begins with attention. Care was just as important. A person could keep themselves warm for a while, but a group survived by protecting the bodies that could not protect themselves as easily. Children, elders, injured people, sick people, and exhausted people all changed the shape of survival. The driest place, the warmest hide, or the safest position near fire may have needed to go to someone more vulnerable. This was not weakness in the group. It was wisdom. A group that protected children, protected its future. A group that protected elders, protected memory. A group that protected injured members, protected trust. In cold rain and snow, care was not separate from survival. It was one of survival's tools. Adaptation was the larger pattern. Early humans could not force every landscape to become the same. A forest, a rocky valley, a snowy plain, and a riverbank each gave different materials and different problems. People had to use what was there. They had to change routes, shelters, coverings, sleeping layers, and fire habits according to place and season. A fixed answer would fail when conditions changed. Adaptation meant listening to the world closely enough to change with it. This is why the story of staying dry is not a story of one perfect invention. It is a story of flexible thinking under pressure. It also teaches humility. We should not imagine early humans as helpless, but we should not turn them into legends who felt no cold and made no mistakes. They were people with real bodies, real limits, and real needs. They suffered wet nights. They lost warmth. They repaired what failed. They learned slowly. Their achievement was not that they became beyond nature. Their achievement was that they learned how to live within nature with increasing skill. They found partial answers and made them work together. They accepted that no hide, no shelter, no fire, no root, and no memory was perfect. Then they kept improving the pattern. That may be the most useful lesson for the listener. Life is often protected by small repeated acts, not by one dramatic solution. A little more attention, a little more preparation, a little more care for the vulnerable, a little more respect for the limits of the body. Early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow because they learned to reduce harm before harm became too strong. They watched the land, guarded the fire, tended their materials, cared for each other, and adjusted when the weather changed. In that slow pattern, we can see a quiet truth about human survival. The mind becomes most valuable when it learns to protect life gently, patiently, and together. And so the story returns to the quiet place where it began. A human body under a wet sky, trying to keep warmth from leaving too quickly. After all the shelters, hides, fires, sleeping layers, roots, memories, and shared care, the answer is still not a single object. Early humans stayed dry in endless rain and snow by making many small agreements with the world. They accepted the shape of a rock overhang. They used the slope of the ground. They learned the weight of a wet hide. They protected embers as if warmth had to be carried through darkness. They placed dry material under sleeping bodies. They moved children closer to safety. They waited for better weather when movement would cost too much, and they moved when staying would become worse. None of this made them separate from nature. It only made them more attentive inside it. That may be the deepest truth of the whole story. Human survival did not begin with control. It began with noticing a drop of water running down stone, smoke bending the wrong way, snow melting near the entrance, a child growing quiet from cold, a hide becoming stiff after drying badly, fuel soaking because it was left on the ground. These small signs taught early humans that life could be protected before danger became final. The skill was not to defeat rain and snow forever. The skill was to reduce their reach, less water against the skin, less wind through the shelter, less cold from the ground, less dampness near the fire, less weakness in the morning. The word dry should not be understood too perfectly here. Early humans were often damp, they were often cold, their shelters leaked, their hides failed, their fires smoked or died, their feet touched mud and snow, but they did not need perfect dryness every time. They needed enough dryness to sleep, enough warmth to wake, enough strength to walk, enough memory to improve the next shelter, and enough care to keep the vulnerable alive through another night. In that sense, staying dry was not a final state. It was a continuous practice. It was done again after each storm, each crossing, each thaw, each mistake, each cold morning. The educational value of this ancient problem is not only about the past. It reminds us that intelligence often grows from respect for limits. The human body has limits, weather has power, materials have weaknesses, communities have responsibilities. Early humans survived because they did not ignore these facts. They learned them closely. They let the world correct them. They turned discomfort into memory, memory into habit, and habit into protection. A dry sleeping layer may seem humble, but it holds a lesson. Care for the body before the body is forced to beg for care. A guarded fire may seem ordinary, but it holds another lesson. What sustains life often needs attention before it disappears. A shared hide, a chosen slope, a sheltered child, a repaired covering, a remembered dry place. All of these show that survival is built from repeated acts of patience. By the end of this story, the rain and snow have not vanished. They are still falling somewhere over the long human past. They fall on stone, on trees, on animal tracks, on dark soil, on hides drying near fire, on people sleeping under rough shelter. But inside that weather, something has changed. Humans have begun to answer water with memory. They have begun to answer cold with arrangement. They have begun to answer exposure with care. They are still vulnerable, But they are no longer only exposed bodies under the sky. They have become observers, makers, teachers, and protectors of warmth. And perhaps that is why the question remains open instead of closed. If early humans learned to stay dry not by escaping rain and snow, but by listening to them, adapting to them, and caring for one another through them, then what did the long wet world quietly teach the human mind to become?